Chapter 1. The Porter and the Palace. In the golden age of Baghdad, when the Caliph Harun al-Rashid ruled over a city of minarets and markets, of silk merchants and spice traders, of poets and philosophers, there lived two men named Sinbad. One was rich beyond measure. The other was poor beyond hope. The poor Sinbad was a porter, a man who carried heavy loads on his back for a few coins, who worked from dawn until dusk in the blazing sun, whose hands were calloused and whose back ached with the weight of other people's goods. He had no family, no home of his own, only a small rented room in the poorest quarter of the city, where the streets were narrow and the shadows deep. Every day was the same. He would wake before sunrise, splash cold water on his face from a clay jug, eat a piece of stale bread if he had one, and make his way to the marketplace. There he would wait with the other porters, hoping that a merchant or a wealthy housewife would need something carried. Sometimes he worked, sometimes he did not. But always, at the end of the day, he was tired, hungry, and no closer to escaping the grinding poverty that defined his existence. On one particularly hot afternoon, when the sun hung in the sky like a copper coin and the air shimmered with heat, poor Sinbad was hired to carry a heavy load of goods across the city. The burden was so great that he had to stop frequently to rest, setting down his load and wiping the sweat from his brow. He found himself in a neighborhood he rarely visited, the wealthy district where the houses were large and beautiful, where fountains sang in private courtyards, where the very air seemed cooler and more fragrant. The streets here were wider, cleaner, lined with date palms and flowering trees. Through ornate gates, he could glimpse gardens where peacocks strutted and roses bloomed in colors he had no names for. Sinbad, the porter, set down his burden in front of one particularly magnificent house. It was 3 stories tall, built of pale stone that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. The windows were framed with intricate wooden lattices. The door was carved cedar, polished to a deep shine. From inside he could hear music, the gentle plucking of an oud, the soft tinkling of bells, the murmur of conversation and laughter. He stood there for a moment, overwhelmed by the contrast between this world and his own. Here, just a few streets away from where he struggled for survival, people lived in comfort and beauty, surrounded by everything he could never hope to have. A wave of bitterness washed over him. It was not fair. Why should he work so hard, suffer so much, and have so little, while others lived in luxury without seeming to lift a finger? O Allah, you who are just and merciful, explain to me why some men live in palaces while others sleep in the streets. Why do some eat from golden plates while others beg for crusts of bread? I work harder than any man I know, yet I have nothing. Others seem to do nothing, yet they have everything. Where is the justice in this? Where is the mercy? His voice carried through the carved wooden door into the cool interior of the house. The music stopped. The conversation ceased. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the door opened. A servant stood there, tall and dignified in fine robes. "My master has heard your words," the servant said. "He invites you to enter. Bring your burden inside and rest. You will be fed and given water, and my master wishes to speak with you." Sinbad the porter hesitated. He was dirty from the day's work, his clothes worn and stained with sweat. He did not belong in a house like this, but the servant was already taking his burden, gesturing for him to follow, and curiosity overcame his shame. He stepped through the doorway into another world. The interior of the house was even more beautiful than he had imagined. The floor was covered with carpets so soft and thick, his feet seemed to sink into them. The walls were decorated with intricate tile work in blues and greens and golds. patterns that seemed to flow like water, like wind, like the endless complexity of creation itself. Crystal lamps hung from the ceiling, filled with scented oil, casting a warm, gentle light even in the middle of the day. The servant led him through several rooms, each more magnificent than the last, until they reached a large courtyard in the center of the house. It was open to the sky with a fountain in the middle, not a simple fountain like the public ones in the market, but an elaborate creation of marble and bronze where water danced and sparkled in the sunlight. Around the fountain, on low couches covered with silk cushions, reclined perhaps 20 men, all well-dressed, all at ease, talking and laughing and enjoying the afternoon. At the head of the gathering, on the finest couch, sat an old man. His beard was white as sea foam, his face lined with age, but his eyes bright and intelligent. He wore robes of the finest fabric, and on his fingers were rings set with stones that caught the light. Sapphires, emeralds, rubies that glowed like captured fire. This, clearly, was the master of the house. This was the rich Sinbad. The old man looked at the porter and smiled, a kind smile, warm and genuine, without any trace of mockery or superiority. "Come," he said, gesturing to a cushion near his own. "Sit, rest. You have been working hard in the heat. Let us give you food and drink, and then perhaps we may talk." Sinbad. The porter sat, feeling awkward and out of place among these wealthy men in their fine clothes. But servants appeared immediately with cool water scented with rose petals, with fresh fruit, dates and figs and pomegranates, with warm bread and honey, with meat cooked with spices that made his mouth water. They brought him a basin to wash his hands and face, brought him a clean cloth to dry himself. He ate slowly, trying to maintain some dignity, but he was so hungry that it was difficult not to simply devour everything placed before him. The food was better than anything he had tasted in months, perhaps years. Each bite seemed like a small miracle. When he had finished eating, when his thirst was quenched and his belly full, the old man spoke again. "You do not know me," he said, "but I know you. Your name is Sinbad, is it not?" The porter nodded, surprised. "Yes, but how did you—" "Because that is my name as well," the old man said with a gentle smile. "I am Sinbad the Sailor, and you are Sinbad the Porter. We share a name, you and I, but as you have observed, we live very different lives. You work hard and have little. I seem to do nothing and have much. You called out to Allah asking why this should be so, why the world is so unjust. Did you not?" The porter felt his face flush with embarrassment. I did not mean to offend. I was tired and bitter. I should not have spoken such words aloud." "No," the old man said firmly. "You should not apologize for honesty. Your question was fair. The world does seem unjust when you look at it from where you stand. I understand. I was once where you are now, perhaps even worse off. I too was young and poor and bitter. I too worked hard for little reward. I too looked at the wealthy and wondered what divine injustice had made them rich and me poor." He paused, his eyes growing distant with memory. "But my poverty led me to make choices, foolish choices perhaps, desperate choices certainly, that took me on 7 voyages across the seas, 7 journeys that brought me wealth, yes, but also terror, suffering, loss, and wisdom I wish I had never needed to learn." The old man looked at the porter directly. "You wonder why I have so much while you have so little. The answer is not divine favoritism or blind luck, though luck played its part. The answer is that I paid for this wealth with fear and pain and the loss of friends and years of my life. I earned every coin of this fortune, but the price was higher than you can imagine." He gestured to the courtyard, to the fine house, to the servants, and the luxury that surrounded them. All of this, it is not a blessing I was given. It is a prize I won by surviving what should have killed me 7 times over. It is compensation for horrors I can never forget, for friends I watched die, for years spent believing I would never see my home again. The old man leaned forward slightly. You asked Allah why the world is unjust. I will tell you, the world is neither just nor unjust. It simply is. It offers opportunities and dangers in equal measure. Some men take the safe path and live quiet lives of modest means. Others, like me, gamble everything on the chance of gaining more, and sometimes they win and sometimes they lose. I won in the end, but I paid a price you cannot see by looking at my house. He paused, then continued. Stay with me tonight. Let me tell you the story of my 7 voyages. Let me show you what lies behind this wealth you envy. Let me explain how a poor boy from Baghdad became rich beyond measure, and whether that wealth was worth what it cost. Then, when I am done, you can decide for yourself whether you envy me or pity me, whether my life has been blessed or cursed, whether the price of wealth is worth paying. Sinbad. The porter sat very still. The afternoon sun slanted through the courtyard, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The fountain sang its endless song. The other guests had grown quiet, listening, for they too had never heard the full story of how their host had gained his fortune. Yes, the porter said quietly, I will stay. I will listen. Tell me your story, Sinbad the Sailor. Tell me about your 7 voyages and what they cost you. Tell me the truth behind this beautiful prison of wealth and memory. The old man nodded slowly. Very well. But be warned. These are not comfortable tales. They are not stories of heroic adventure where the brave sailor conquers every challenge with courage and cleverness. They are stories of survival, of luck, both good and bad, of mistakes and consequences, of learning too late what really matters in life. He settled back into his cushions, his eyes growing distant as he looked into the past, into memory, into the young man he had been so long ago. The first voyage, he began, his voice taking on the rhythmic quality of a practiced storyteller, began with restlessness and foolishness. And so, as the afternoon faded into evening, as the servants lit the crystal lamps and brought more food and drink, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above the courtyard, Sinbad the Sailor began to tell his story. Chapter 2. The First Voyage. The Island That Swam. I was young, Sinbad the Sailor began, his voice soft with memory. Perhaps 20 years old, full of energy and ambition and the kind of arrogance that comes from never having truly suffered. My father had been a merchant, not wealthy like I am now, but comfortable. He left me a modest inheritance when he died, enough to live on if I was careful, enough to invest in a small business if I was wise. He paused, a sad smile crossing his face. I was not wise. I was young and restless and hungry for excitement. The stories I had heard since childhood, tales of distant lands, of strange peoples, of exotic goods that could be bought for copper and sold for gold, these stories sang to me like sirens calling a sailor to his doom. I took my inheritance and spent it on luxury, fine clothes, expensive food, entertainment, gifts for friends who were not really friends. Within a year, the money was nearly gone. I stood in my father's empty house, looking at the bare walls, the sold furniture, the emptiness where comfort and security had once been, and I realized what a fool I had been. The old man took a sip of water from a silver cup before continuing. But instead of learning the obvious lesson, that I should work hard, save carefully, build slowly, I decided to gamble what little remained on a desperate venture. I would become a merchant sailor. I would travel to distant lands, buy goods cheap and sell them dear, and return home wealthy. It was a simple plan, a foolish plan, but I was young, and the young believe themselves invincible. I used the last of my money to buy a small amount of merchandise, carpets mostly, and some brass goods. I booked passage on a trading ship bound for the Indies, for the islands of spices and silk that lay far to the east, beyond the horizon, beyond the edge of the familiar world. Sinbad the Sailor's eyes grew distant, seeing something the others could not see. I remember standing on the dock in Basra, watching the sailors load the ship. She was called the Marjan, the Coral, a beautiful vessel with a hull painted in blues and greens, with great triangular sails that seemed to capture not just wind but possibility itself. The captain was an experienced man, weathered by decades at sea, who looked at us merchants with a mixture of tolerance and contempt. We were cargo to him, paying passengers, no more valuable than the bales of silk or jars of oil in the hold. We set sail on a morning when the sky was clear and the wind was favorable. I stood at the rail as Basra grew smaller and smaller behind us, as the land gave way to endless water, as everything familiar disappeared and only the unknown remained. I felt fear, yes, but also exhilaration. I was leaving my old life behind. I was becoming someone new. I was becoming the person I was meant to be. The old man's voice grew softer. How little I knew, how little I understood about who I was meant to be or what that becoming would require. For 2 weeks we sailed without incident. The days were hot and the nights cool. I learned the rhythm of a ship at sea, the constant motion, the creaking of wood and ropes, the snap of canvas in the wind. I learned to sleep in a hammock, to eat simple food prepared in a tiny galley, to relieve myself over the side while holding onto a rope. I learned the hierarchy of the ship, the captain and his officers, the experienced sailors, the merchants like myself at the bottom of the order, tolerated but not respected. We stopped at several ports along the coast. In each one, I watched the other merchants trade, learning how it was done, the bargaining, the inspection of goods, the careful assessment of quality and value. I made a few small trades myself, selling some carpets and buying spices. I began to think I understood the business. I began to believe I would succeed. He paused, shaking his head at his younger self's naivety, and then we reached the island. The courtyard had grown very quiet. Even the fountain seemed to have lowered its voice. The other guests leaned forward slightly, drawn into the story. It appeared on the horizon on a bright morning, Sinbad continued. A green jewel rising from the blue sea, lush vegetation, white beaches, the promise of fresh water and solid ground after weeks of endless ocean. The captain decided to stop there to take on water and give the crew and passengers a chance to stretch their legs on firm earth. We anchored offshore and took small boats to the beach. I remember the feeling of sand under my feet after so long on the swaying deck. The solidity of it, the realness. I walked up the beach with some of the other merchants, marveling at the beauty of the place. Fruit trees grew near the shore, dates and coconuts. Fresh water ran in a small stream. Birds sang in the branches. It seemed like paradise. Sinbad's voice changed, becoming more tense. We decided to prepare a meal. Some of the sailors built a fire on the beach. We would roast meat, boil water for tea, enjoy a proper meal instead of the ship's rations. I gathered wood for the fire, happy to be useful, pleased with how well the voyage was going. I had been afraid for nothing, I thought. The sea was not dangerous, travel was easy, I would be rich and home again within a few months. He stopped, his hands gripping the arms of his couch. The fire grew hot. We piled more wood on it, building it up to cook our meat properly. The flames rose higher, crackling and snapping, sending sparks into the air. And then the old man closed his eyes. The island moved. At first I thought it was my imagination, a slight tremor beneath my feet like an earthquake. But then it happened again, stronger this time. The ground bucked and shuddered, trees swayed. The stream suddenly changed course, water sloshing and splashing, and someone, I don't remember who, screamed, "It's not an island, it's alive." In that moment of terrible understanding, everything changed. The ground beneath us began to shift more violently. What we had thought was sandy beach was actually rough, leathery hide. What we had thought was rocky outcroppings were actually enormous scales. We were not on an island at all. We were standing on the back of a creature so vast we had mistaken it for land itself. Sinbad's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. It was a whale of such immense size that its body, floating at the surface of the ocean, could be mistaken for an island. It had been sleeping perhaps for years, and we had woken it. The fire, burning on its back, had roused it from its ancient slumber. The creature began to move, not quickly. Nothing that massive could move quickly, but deliberately, powerfully, diving deeper into the ocean, seeking relief from the fire that burned on its back. The island tilted. The trees began to slide. The stream became a waterfall rushing off the side of the descending creature, and we, the sailors, the merchants, all of us, we began to slide too. I remember the chaos. People screaming, running, trying to reach the boats. The smaller boat had already been smashed by the creature's movement, reduced to splinters floating on the water. The captain was shouting from the ship, ordering the crew to pull up anchor, to prepare to sail, to save the vessel, even if it meant leaving us behind. I ran toward the remaining boat, my feet slipping on the tilting surface. One of my fellow merchants fell beside me, tumbling down the slope of the creature's back, disappearing into the frothing water. I heard him scream once, and then nothing. The island was sinking faster now, the whale diving deep, taking us all down with it. Sinbad opened his eyes, looking at his audience. I have no memory of deciding to jump. I was simply suddenly in the water, the shock of it driving the air from my lungs. The sea was chaos, waves and foam, debris from the camp, thrashing bodies, the massive bulk of the whale disappearing into the depths. I went under, came up gasping, went under again. When I surfaced the second time, I saw a piece of wood floating near me, part of the water trough we had brought from the ship. I grabbed it, held on with all my strength. Around me I could see other survivors doing the same, clinging to debris, to each other, to anything that would float. The ship was leaving. I could see it clearly, sails filling with wind, moving away from the danger. I screamed for them to come back, to save us, but my voice was lost in the noise of waves and wind. The captain had made his choice. The ship was more valuable than the passengers. We were expendable. We were lost. The old man fell silent for a moment, lost in the memory of that terror, that abandonment, that moment when he realized he was going to die far from home, his body food for fish, his name forgotten, his ambitions reduced to nothing. I don't know how long I floated there, he finally continued. Hours, certainly. Perhaps a day. The sun beat down on my head. Salt water stung my eyes, my lips, every cut and scrape on my body. My arms ached from holding onto the wooden plank. Every part of me wanted to let go, to sink into the blue depths, to accept the death that seemed inevitable. But I held on. Not from courage, I had no courage left. Not from hope, I had no hope. I held on from simple, stupid stubbornness, from the refusal to accept what seemed certain, from something animal and mindless that would not let me surrender. And then, as the sun was setting, painting the sky in colors too beautiful for such a terrible day, I saw something on the horizon. Land. Real land this time, not a sleeping monster but actual earth and stone. An island rising from the sea, with cliffs and beaches and trees that were rooted in soil, not floating on an ancient creature's back. The current was carrying me toward it, slowly, so slowly, but definitely in that direction. I kicked my legs, tried to paddle with one hand while holding the plank with the other, helping the current do its work. As darkness fell, I drew closer. I could hear waves breaking on rocks, could smell earth and vegetation. I washed ashore in complete darkness, so exhausted I could barely crawl above the waterline before I collapsed. I lay on the beach, shivering despite the warm night, my body shaking with cold and shock and the aftermath of terror. I had survived. Against all odds, impossibly, I had survived. Sinbad the Sailor looked around at his audience. That was my first lesson from the sea, that the world is full of dangers we cannot anticipate, that what seems safe can kill you, that comfort and security are illusions, that survival sometimes requires nothing more than stubborn refusal to die. He took another sip of water. But the voyage was far from over. I had survived the whale, yes, but I was alone on an unknown island, with nothing but the clothes on my back. I had no food, no water, no way to return home. My first adventure had barely begun. Chapter 3. Rescue and the First Fortune. Sinbad. The sailor shifted in his cushions, his eyes still distant with memory. The stars were bright now in the darkening sky above the courtyard, and servants had brought more lamps, their gentle light casting dancing shadows on the tiled walls. When morning came, he continued, I woke to find myself on a beautiful beach. White sand, clear blue water gently lapping at the shore, palm trees swaying in a warm breeze. If I had not been so thirsty, so hungry, so sore in every muscle and bone, it would have seemed like paradise. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky, and looked around. The island was larger than I had realized in the darkness. I could see hills rising in the interior, covered in green vegetation. Birds called from the trees, strange birds with bright plumage and voices I had never heard before. Everything was foreign, unknown, potentially dangerous. My first concern was water. Without water, I would die within days, perhaps sooner in this heat. I walked along the beach, hoping to find a stream or spring. My lips were cracked and bleeding from the salt water. My tongue felt swollen. Every step was an effort. After perhaps an hour of walking, I found what I was looking for. A small waterfall cascading down from the hills, forming a clear pool before running across the beach into the sea. I fell to my knees beside it and drank deeply, the cold, fresh water like a miracle in my parched throat. I drank until my stomach hurt, then sat back, feeling life slowly returning to my body. The old man smiled slightly. I have drunk from golden cups in palaces, from crystal glasses in the finest homes in Baghdad, but no drink has ever tasted as good as that water from a small pool on an unnamed island when I thought I might die of thirst. Food was next. I was weak with hunger, my stomach cramping. I found fruit trees near the stream, mangoes and bananas and something else I could not identify, but which tasted sweet and filled my belly. I ate until I was satisfied, then ate more, storing energy against future need. For 3 days I lived on that beach. I built a small shelter from palm fronds to protect me from the sun. I caught fish in the shallows using a spear I fashioned from a straight branch. I explored the immediate area, mapping it in my mind, learning what was safe and what to avoid. There were snakes on the island, I discovered, and large lizards that watched me with ancient, incurious eyes, But nothing seemed actively hostile. Nothing attacked me. On the fourth day I saw a ship. Sinbad leaned forward slightly. It appeared on the horizon in the afternoon, a merchant vessel, its sails full of wind, passing perhaps a mile offshore. I ran to the beach, waving my arms, shouting until my voice was raw. But the ship continued on its course, either not seeing me or not caring. I watched it disappear over the horizon, and for the first time since washing ashore, I felt despair. What if no one ever came? What if I was doomed to live out my days on this island, alone, forgotten, dying eventually of disease or accident or simple loneliness? But I did not give up. Each day I gathered wood and dried it in the sun, preparing a signal fire. I cleared a section of beach, arranging white stones to spell out a message, though who would see it from the air, I did not know. I did these things because doing nothing would have driven me mad. I did them because hope, however faint, is better than despair. And then, on the seventh day, I heard voices. The old man paused, letting the moment stretch. Human voices, speaking Arabic, coming from the interior of the island, from the hills I had not dared to explore alone. I ran toward the sound, crashing through underbrush, heedless of thorns and branches, desperate for human contact after a week of solitude. I found them on a hillside, a group of men, perhaps 20 of them, with horses and equipment. They were merchants, I realized, engaged in some kind of harvesting operation. They had set up a temporary camp with tents and cooking fires, and they stared at me in astonishment as I burst from the jungle, filthy and wild-eyed, babbling about whale islands and shipwrecks. Their leader, a tall man with a sharp face and shrewd eyes, listened to my story with skepticism. But one of the younger men recognized the name of the ship I had been on, the Marjan. He had seen her in port, he said, had even spoken with her captain. This lent credibility to my tale, and gradually the merchant leader's expression softened from suspicion to sympathy. "You are fortunate," he told me. "We come to this island only twice a year to harvest a particular type of wood that grows here. If you had arrived a week later, you would have missed us. You would have been alone for at least 6 more months." Sinbad shook his head at the memory. 6 months. I would not have survived 6 months on that island. I would have gone mad long before then, talking to myself, to the birds, to the ghosts of my drowned companions. Allah was merciful. He had saved me from the whale, brought me to land, and now placed me in the path of rescuers. I thanked him then, on my knees on that hillside, with more sincere gratitude than I had ever felt in my comfortable life in Baghdad. The merchants gave me food, clothes, a place in their camp. They treated me kindly, perhaps because they could imagine themselves in my position. All sailors know that fortune is fickle. Today you are the merchant on the ship. Tomorrow you are the castaway on the beach. It is wise to show mercy, for you may need it yourself one day. I worked alongside them for the next week, helping to cut and prepare the valuable wood they had come to harvest. The work was hard, but I was grateful for it. It gave me purpose. It made me feel human again after my week of solitary survival. And then, on the day before we were to leave the island and sail for their home port, something extraordinary happened. The old man's eyes brightened at the memory. I was working near the beach, hauling wood to be loaded onto their ships, when one of the merchants called me over. He was standing beside a pile of cargo that had just been brought down from the hills, crates and bundles wrapped in oilcloth, and he was frowning at a marking on one of the crates. "This is strange," he said. "These crates were here when we arrived. Someone else has been to this island. Someone else has cached goods here." He knelt down to examine the crate more closely, and I saw his eyes widen. "By Allah," he whispered, "I know this mark. This is cargo from the Marjan. My heart began to pound. The Marjan? My ship? Yes, the merchant said. She made it back to port despite the incident with the whale. The captain reported that several passengers were lost, including their goods. These must be the belongings of someone who... He stopped, looking at me with dawning realization. What was your name again? Sinbad, I said. He pointed at the mark on the crate. These are marked with the name Sinbad the Merchant. Are these yours? The old man smiled. They were. My goods. The carpets and brass items I had purchased in Baghdad that I thought had gone down with me when the island whale sank, but they had remained on the ship. The captain, assuming I was dead, had apparently unloaded them at various ports, caching them to be sold later or claimed by my heirs if any could be found. And now, by the strangest chance, I had found them, or they had found me, on an island hundreds of miles from where I had been presumed dead. The merchant leader examined the goods carefully. These are valuable, he said. Fine quality. If you can prove these are truly yours, they will give you a fresh start. I described every item in the crates, the pattern of the carpets, the design on the brass plates. The merchant had no choice but to believe me. I knew details no one else could know. The goods were mine by right, and they were worth far more here in these foreign ports than they had been in Baghdad. Sinbad leaned back. And so, from the disaster of my first voyage, I gained my first fortune. I sold some of the goods to the merchants who had rescued me, traded others at the ports we visited on our way home. By the time we reached Basra, by the time I finally returned to Baghdad after 6 months away, I had more money than I had started with, more money than my father had left me, enough to rebuild my life, to restore my father's house, to live comfortably. I told myself I would never go to sea again, that I had learned my lesson, that the terror of floating in the ocean, clinging to driftwood, waiting to die, that terror was enough for a lifetime. I would invest my money wisely. I would become a sensible merchant in Baghdad. I would forget the sea. He paused. But of course I did not forget. The sea never releases those who have sailed her. Within a year, I was restless again. Within 2 years, I was planning another voyage. The first voyage had ended in disaster, yes, but it had also ended in fortune. What if I could repeat that fortune without repeating the disaster? What if I could become truly wealthy, not just comfortable? The old man looked at his guests. That is how the second voyage began, not from necessity, as the first had, but from greed, from the desire for more, from the belief that I had learned enough to avoid danger, that I was clever enough to profit without paying the price. He fell silent, and one of the other guests asked quietly, "And were you clever enough?" Sinbad the Sailor laughed, a short, bitter sound. The second voyage taught me that the sea does not care about clever, that there are fates worse than drowning, that sometimes survival is more terrible than death. He looked up at the sky, at the stars shining in their ancient patterns. But that is a story for tomorrow. For tonight I am tired. We are all tired. Let us eat dinner, rest, and tomorrow I will tell you about the Valley of Diamonds and the bird whose wings blotted out the sun. I will tell you how I gained even greater wealth and nearly lost my mind in the process. Sinbad the porter, who had been sitting transfixed throughout the tale, spoke for the first time in hours. "You will continue? You will tell us the rest?" "Yes," the old man said. "I promised you the truth behind this wealth. One voyage is not enough to explain it. You must hear all 7. You must understand what I paid, what I lost, what I learned. Only then can you judge whether I am blessed or cursed, whether you envy me or pity me." He clapped his hands, and servants appeared with trays of food. But for now, let us eat. Let us enjoy the comfort of solid ground beneath us, of friends around us, of full bellies and soft cushions, and the knowledge that tonight, at least, we are safe. Tomorrow, I will take you back to the sea. Tomorrow, I will show you the price of a second voyage and a third and all the others that followed. Tomorrow, you will understand why this house, beautiful as it is, sometimes feels like a prison, why wealth, vast as mine is, cannot buy back the years or the friends or the innocence I lost. And so they ate and talked of other things, and eventually retired to comfortable beds in guest rooms prepared for them. And Sinbad the porter lay awake long into the night, thinking about whale islands and floating on debris and being rescued by impossible chance. He thought about how close the old man had come to death, how easily Sinbad the sailor could have been just another drowned merchant, forgotten, his name lost, his story never told. And he wondered what the next 6 voyages would reveal, what other dangers lurked in the world beyond Baghdad's safe walls, what other prices would be demanded for wealth and adventure, and the stubborn refusal to accept a simple, quiet life. But he was also beginning to understand something the old man had tried to tell him, that every fortune has a cost, that nothing valuable comes without price, that the world is neither just nor unjust, it simply demands payment for everything it gives. And sometimes that payment is more than anyone should have to pay. Sleep came slowly, and when it came, it brought dreams of vast blue oceans, of islands that moved beneath your feet, of sinking into dark water while a ship sailed away without looking back. Dreams that were not dreams but memories, not his own, but borrowed from the old man's story, as vivid and terrible as if he had lived them himself. This is what stories do. They enter us, they change us, they show us truths we need to see, whether we want to see them or not. And tomorrow, there would be more stories, more truths, more prices revealed. The 7 voyages had barely begun. Chapter 4. The Second Voyage. The Valley of Serpents. The next evening, as the sun set over Baghdad and the call to prayer echoed from distant minarets, the guests gathered once again in Sinbad the Sailor's courtyard. The porter arrived early, unable to stay away, his mind still full of the previous night's tale. He found the old man already there, sitting by the fountain, staring into the water as if seeing something far beyond its surface. "You came back," Sinbad the sailor said, looking up with a slight smile. "How could I not?" the porter replied. "Your story, it haunts me. I dreamed of drowning last night, of being abandoned by a ship sailing away into the distance." The old man nodded. "I still have those dreams decades later. Some experiences mark you so deeply that sleep brings them back again and again, as fresh as the day they happened." He gestured to a cushion. "Sit, the others will arrive soon, and then I will tell you about the second voyage, the one I should never have taken, the one that taught me that some treasures are bought at too high a price." As darkness fell and the other guests arrived, as servants brought food and drink and lit the lamps around the courtyard, Sinbad the sailor began his second tale. 2 years passed after my return from the first voyage," he said. 2 comfortable years. I had restored my father's house. I had money in my coffers. I ate well, dressed well, wanted for nothing. I should have been content. He paused. But contentment is a strange thing. When you have known poverty, comfort feels like wealth. When you have known terror, safety feels like paradise. But when comfort becomes familiar, when safety becomes routine, the human heart grows restless. It forgets the lessons of fear. it begins to hunger for more. I found myself thinking about the sea, about distant ports I had glimpsed from the deck of that first ship, about the merchants I had met who spoke of islands where pearls could be gathered from the beach, of cities where gold was common as copper, of trade routes that could make a man wealthy beyond imagining. The memory of terror faded. The desire for wealth grew stronger. The second voyage began, not from necessity but from greed, not from poverty, but from the inability to be satisfied with enough. I convinced myself that I had learned from the first voyage, that I was wiser now, more experienced, that the disaster with the whale had been bad luck, a one-time event, not something that would happen again. I equipped myself better this time. I bought high-quality goods, silks, spices, worked metal. I chose a larger ship with an experienced captain who came recommended by other merchants. I prepared carefully, taking time to learn about the routes we would follow, the ports we would visit, the dangers we might encounter. We sailed from Basra on a clear morning, and for the first weeks, everything went smoothly. We stopped at familiar ports, traded profitably, moved on. I began to relax, to think that my fears had been foolish. The sea was not so dangerous after all. I had simply been unlucky the first time. The old man's voice grew softer. The sea heard my arrogance, and the sea answered. We had been at sea for perhaps 2 months when we reached an archipelago, a scattering of islands, some large, some small, many uninhabited. The captain decided to stop at one of the larger islands to take on fresh water and allow the crew to rest on solid ground. It seemed safe enough. Other ships had stopped there before. It was marked on the charts as a good harbor. We anchored offshore and went ashore in small boats. The island was beautiful, lush vegetation, fruit trees, clean streams running down from hills in the interior. Some of the crew set up camp on the beach. Others, including myself, decided to explore further inland. I walked with a group of 5 other merchants, following a stream into the interior. The forest was thick, but not impenetrable. Birds sang in the trees. Butterflies the size of my hand drifted through patches of sunlight. It was peaceful, serene, like a garden from paradise. We walked for perhaps an hour, enjoying the exercise after so long confined to the ship. Then one of my companions suggested we rest. We found a pleasant clearing beside the stream, with soft grass and shade from tall trees. We sat down, ate some fruit we had brought with us, talked lazily about trade and profit, and what we would buy when we returned home. Sinbad paused, his hands tightening on the arms of his couch. I lay back in the grass, staring up at the canopy of leaves above me, and closed my eyes. The sound of the stream was soothing. The air was warm but not too hot. I felt drowsy, content, safe. I fell asleep. When I woke, the sun was much lower in the sky. Hours had passed. I sat up quickly, confused about where I was for a moment. Then memory returned. The island, the exploration, my companions. But my companions were gone. I stood up calling their names. No answer. I walked back along the stream, thinking perhaps they had returned to the beach without waking me. But the forest was empty, silent. Even the birds had stopped singing. I began to run, panic rising in my chest. I ran until I broke through the trees onto the beach where we had landed. The beach was empty, the boats were gone, and far out on the water, growing smaller by the moment, I could see the ship with its sails full of wind, the ship leaving without me. The old man's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They had left me behind, again. For the second time in 2 voyages, I had been abandoned on an island, left to die alone, forgotten. I stood on that beach and screamed until my voice gave out. I cursed the captain, cursed my companions, cursed my own stupidity for falling asleep. But the ship continued on its course, and my voice was lost in the sound of waves and wind, and after a while I fell silent because there was no point in screaming anymore. Night fell. I sat on the beach, too devastated to move, to think, to plan. I had survived the Whale Island only to end up in exactly the same situation, alone, stranded, doomed. But as darkness deepened, I began to hear sounds from the interior of the island, strange sounds, rustling in the underbrush, low hissing noises, the crack of branches breaking. Something was moving in the forest, many somethings, and they were getting closer. Sinbad looked around at his audience, making sure they were listening. I climbed a tree near the beach. It was not a conscious decision, pure instinct, the animal part of my brain recognizing danger and seeking height. I climbed until I was perhaps 20 feet above the ground, wedged myself into the crook of 2 branches, and waited. The moon rose, full and bright, turning the beach silver, and in that moonlight I saw them emerge from the forest. Serpents! Not small snakes like we have in Baghdad, not even large pythons like I had seen in markets, brought from distant lands as curiosities. These were serpents as thick as a man's torso, 30 feet long or more, with scales that gleamed like metal in the moonlight. Their heads were massive, their eyes cold and reptilian, their mouths filled with teeth designed for seizing and crushing prey. There were dozens of them. They flowed out of the forest like a living river, spreading across the beach, their bodies moving in sinuous waves. They were hunting, searching, and I realized, with horror, that they were searching for me, for any warm-blooded creature foolish enough to be on their island after dark. The old man took a shaky breath. I clung to my tree branch and tried not to move, not to breathe, not to do anything that might draw their attention. The serpents passed beneath me, so close I could have touched them. I could hear the dry rasp of scales on sand, could smell a musty odor like old leather left too long in dampness. One of them paused directly below my tree. It raised its head, testing the air with its forked tongue. I was certain it had sensed me, that it would climb the tree. I had heard stories of snakes that could climb anything, but after a moment it lowered its head and continued on, following the others down the beach. I spent the entire night in that tree. My muscles cramped. My arms and legs went numb from maintaining the same position for hours. But I did not move, did not dare to move, because the serpents returned throughout the night, patrolling the beach, searching for prey. When dawn finally came, when the first light touched the horizon, the serpents retreated into the forest. They moved sluggishly now, as if the coming daylight weakened them. Within minutes they had all disappeared, leaving the beach empty and peaceful again, as if they had never been there at all. I climbed down from the tree slowly, my body stiff and aching. I knew I could not stay on the island. The serpents would return with nightfall, and the next time they might find me. I had to escape, but how? I had no boat, no way to build one, no tools, no materials, nothing. Sinbad gestured toward the fountain. I walked along the beach, looking for something, anything that might help me survive, and that is when I saw it. A cave in the cliff face, about 50 feet above the beach, accessible by a narrow, rocky path. It was not much, but it was high enough that the serpents probably could not reach it. It would give me shelter, a place to hide during the night. I climbed up to the cave and explored it cautiously. It was deeper than I expected, running back into the cliff for perhaps 30 feet. The floor was dry. There were no signs of animal habitation. It seemed safe enough. I spent the day gathering supplies, fruit from the trees, water from a stream, wood that I could use to block the cave entrance at night. And when evening came, when I saw the first serpents emerging from the forest, I retreated to my cave. I piled rocks and branches across the narrow entrance, leaving just enough space to breathe, but not enough for a serpent to enter. And then I sat in the darkness, listening to the sounds of them moving below, and I prayed. I prayed for rescue, for deliverance, for death if rescue was not coming, because the thought of spending weeks or months or years in this cave, hiding every night from serpents, slowly going mad from loneliness and fear, that thought was almost worse than death itself. The old man was quiet for a moment. I lived that way for 3 days, 3 nights of hiding in the cave while the serpents hunted outside, 3 days of searching the horizon for ships that never came. I began to lose hope, began to think this was how I would die, not killed by the serpents, but wasted away by starvation or thirst or simple despair. And then on the 4th day I found the valley. Chapter 5. The Valley of Diamonds. I had been exploring the island during daylight, always returning to my cave before sunset, Sinbad continued. On the 4th day, I ventured further inland than before, desperate to find some way off the island. Perhaps there was another beach, another harbor, some place where ships might stop. I had to look. Waiting passively for rescue had not worked on the whale island. It would not work here either. I followed the stream I had walked along on that first day, the day I had fallen asleep and been abandoned. The stream led up into the hills, and I followed it, climbing higher, pushing through vegetation, ignoring scratches and thorns. If I was going to die on this island, at least I would die knowing I had tried everything. The stream led to a waterfall, a beautiful cascade tumbling down from a cliff perhaps 100 feet high. I stood at its base, wondering if I could climb the cliff, if there might be something useful at the top. And that is when I noticed something strange. The water was not falling into a pool. It was disappearing into a crack in the rock face, a narrow opening partially hidden by the falling water. I do not know what made me investigate. Curiosity, perhaps, or the desperation of someone who has nothing left to lose. I waded into the pool at the base of the waterfall, letting the cascade pound on my head and shoulders, and squeezed through the opening. Sinbad's eyes grew distant with memory. On the other side was a cave, but not like the cave where I had been hiding. This was vast, a cathedral carved by water over countless centuries. The stream flowed through it, running toward darkness deeper in the earth, and the walls sparkled. At first I thought it was moisture catching the dim light that filtered through the entrance, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized I was seeing something else. The walls were studded with crystals, with gems, with stones that caught and reflected light, turning the cave into a place of impossible beauty. I moved deeper into the cave, following the stream, and the sparkles grew more numerous. The floor crunched beneath my feet. I knelt down and picked up what I thought was a pebble. It was rough, unpolished, but unmistakable. A diamond, a raw diamond, perhaps the size of a walnut. The old man looked at his guests. I was standing in a valley of diamonds, a cave where gems lay scattered on the ground like common stones. Wealth beyond measure, hidden inside a mountain on an island infested with serpents. I laughed then. I could not help it. The absurdity of it. Abandoned on an island where I would probably die, only to discover enough wealth to buy a palace, to buy 100 palaces. What good were diamonds when you had no food, no water, no way to leave? What use was treasure when you were already dead? But even as I laughed, I was filling my pockets. Some instinct, greed, hope, foolishness, made me gather the diamonds. I stuffed them into my clothes, picked the largest and clearest stones, took as many as I could carry. If I somehow survived, if by some miracle I escaped this island, I would be rich, richer than I had ever imagined. I was so focused on gathering diamonds that I almost did not notice when the cave grew darker. The light coming through the entrance was fading. Sunset was approaching, and I was far from my safe cave above the beach. Sinbad's voice quickened. I ran, stumbled back through the diamond cave, squeezed through the narrow opening, splashed through the waterfall. The sun was touching the horizon. I had perhaps 30 minutes before full darkness, perhaps less, and I was at least an hour's walk from my shelter. I ran through the forest as darkness fell around me. Branches whipped my face. Roots tried to trip me. My lungs burned. My legs screamed in protest. But I ran anyway, because the alternative was to be caught in the open when the serpents emerged for their nightly hunt. I reached the beach just as the last light faded from the sky, and I saw them, the serpents, already emerging from the forest, their massive bodies flowing across the sand. I ran for the cliff path, climbing desperately, my hands slipping on the rocks, the diamonds in my pockets weighing me down. I reached the cave entrance just as one of the serpents reached the bottom of the path. It paused there, its head raised, tongue testing the air. It knew I was close, but the path was narrow, steep. After a moment, the serpent turned away, seeking easier prey elsewhere. I collapsed inside the cave, gasping for breath, my heart hammering. I was safe. For another night I was safe. But the diamonds that had seemed so worthless an hour ago now felt different. They were proof that this island had value, that ships might come here, not by accident, but intentionally, to harvest this treasure, which meant rescue might be possible after all. The old man shifted in his cushions. That night I did not sleep. I sat at the cave entrance looking out at the moonlit beach, thinking about the diamonds, about escape, about survival. And as I sat there, I saw something strange, something moving high above the ocean, something enormous. At first, I thought it was a cloud, but clouds do not fly with purpose. They do not circle and wheel like a hunting bird. This was alive. And as it passed in front of the moon, I saw its shape clearly. Wings, massive wings, each perhaps 50 feet across, a body the size of an elephant, a bird, but a bird so large it seemed impossible, a creature from legend and nightmare. Sinbad looked around at his audience. It was a roc, a bird so enormous it feeds on elephants, on whales, on anything large enough to satisfy its hunger. I had heard stories of such creatures, told by sailors around campfires, dismissed as fantasy, as exaggeration. But this was real. This was hunting above my island, circling, searching. I watched it for perhaps an hour. It seemed to be focused on something inland, somewhere deep in the forest. Finally, it folded its wings and dropped from sight beyond the hills. I heard faintly a tremendous crashing sound. Then, silence. In the morning, I decided to investigate. The roc had landed somewhere on the island. Perhaps it had a nest. Perhaps there was a way to use this creature to escape. It was a desperate idea, a foolish idea, but I was desperate and had no better options. I followed the stream inland again, past the Diamond Valley, higher into the hills, and there, in a clearing at the very top of the island, I found what I was looking for. The nest. It was enormous, a mass of branches and logs piled perhaps 20 feet high, forming a platform large enough to hold a house. And in the center of the nest, gleaming white in the sunlight, was an egg, a single egg, the size of a small barrel. Sinbad paused. And beside the egg, sleeping in the sun, was the roc itself, I had never seen anything so magnificent and so terrifying. Its feathers gleamed like burnished bronze. Its talons were the size of scimitars. Its beak could have bitten a man in half. It lay with its head tucked under one wing, breathing slowly, deeply, completely unaware of my presence. I approached carefully, quietly, my heart in my throat. I had a plan. Insane, impossible, but the only plan I had. If I could somehow attach myself to the rock, it might carry me away from the island when it flew. I might die in the attempt. The bird might discover me and kill me. But staying on the island meant certain death eventually. At least this way, I was trying. I had prepared a rope from vines while hiding in my cave, something to do during the long nights of fear and boredom. Now I unwound this rope, crept closer to the sleeping bird, and began to tie one end around its leg. The rock's leg was as thick as a tree trunk, scaled with rough skin. I worked quickly, my hands shaking, expecting at any moment for the creature to wake, to see me, to crush me with those enormous talons, but it continued sleeping, undisturbed. I tied the other end of the rope around my waist, pulled it tight, and then retreated to hide in the underbrush at the edge of the clearing. And I waited. The old man took a drink of water before continuing. The sun climbed higher. The day grew hot. I drowsed in my hiding place, exhausted from days of fear and poor sleep, and then, suddenly, I was jolted awake by a sound like thunder. The rock was taking flight. Its wings beat the air with incredible force, creating winds that bent trees and tore branches free. It rose from the nest, the rope attaching me to its leg snapping tight, and then I was being dragged across the ground, through the underbrush, into the air. I screamed, not from fear, though I was terrified, but from pure instinct. The ground fell away below me, the island grew smaller, the ocean appeared, vast and blue and endless. We climbed higher and higher, the rock's wings beating steadily, powerfully, carrying us both into the sky. I clung to the rope with both hands, my legs dangling, my whole body swinging with each beat of the enormous wings. The wind tore at my clothes, tried to rip me free. Below, I could see the island complete now, a green jewel in a blue sea, with a valley of diamonds hidden in its heart, with serpents sleeping in dark places, with the cave where I had hidden growing too small to see. We flew for what seemed like hours. My hands cramped, my arms ached. The sun beat down mercilessly. I began to wonder if I would simply fall, if my strength would give out and I would plummet into the ocean far below. But I held on, stubborn, stupid, refusing to let go even when letting go seemed like mercy. And then finally the rock began to descend. Chapter 6. Escape and the Second Fortune. The rock was descending toward land, not an island this time, but what appeared to be a coastline, a mainland with hills and forests stretching to the horizon. As we dropped lower, I could see a valley between two mountains. The rock was heading for that valley, its wings adjusting, preparing to land. We touched down with jarring force. The rock immediately released a piercing cry, a sound so loud it hurt my ears even from where I hung beneath its leg. Then it began to walk, dragging me behind it, my body bouncing and scraping across rocky ground. I fumbled with the knots at my waist, trying to free myself before the bird realized I was there. My fingers, numb from hours of gripping the rope, barely functioned, but fear gave me strength. The knots loosened. The rope fell away. I rolled to the side, putting distance between myself and the enormous creature. The rock did not notice my escape. It was focused on something else, a carcass lying nearby. Some large animal, dead for days perhaps, that the bird had come to feed upon. It began to tear at the meat with its massive beak, completely absorbed in its meal. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I did not look back, did not pause, just ran blindly away from the valley, away from the rock, away from immediate danger. I ran until my legs gave out, until I collapsed in a heap in the shade of some rocks, gasping for breath, trembling with exhaustion and relief. Sinbad smiled slightly. I was alive. Against all odds, impossibly, I was alive. I had survived the Serpent Island. I had survived the flight attached to a rock. I had diamonds in my pockets and bruises covering my body and no idea where I was, but I was alive. I rested for perhaps an hour, letting my racing heart slow, letting my exhausted muscles recover slightly. Then I stood and looked around, trying to understand where the rock had brought me. I was in a valley surrounded by steep cliffs. Rocky ground stretched in all directions with little vegetation. The sun beat down mercilessly. It was a desolate place, harsh and unwelcoming. But at least there were no serpents. At least I was on solid ground, not clinging to a rope thousands of feet above the ocean. I began to walk, following the valley, hoping it would lead somewhere, anywhere, and as I walked, I noticed something strange. The ground was littered with things, lumps, bundles, objects that seemed out of place in this barren landscape. I approached one of these bundles and examined it. It was a sheep carcass, wrapped in leather, fairly fresh. How had it gotten here? Why would someone leave dead sheep in this valley? And then I understood. I had heard stories, tales told by merchants about a place where diamonds could be found, but the valley was too steep to enter and too dangerous to escape. So traders would throw meat into the valley. Diamonds would stick to the meat. Then birds, eagles, and yes, rocks would carry the meat out to feed. The traders would chase away the birds and recover the meat, along with any diamonds attached to it. The old man gestured around his courtyard. I was in that valley, the legendary Diamond Valley that merchants spoke of but few had ever seen. And the rock had carried me here, to this place of wealth and danger. I checked my pockets. The diamonds I had gathered on the island were still there, rough stones that would be worth a fortune once cut and polished. But here, in this valley, there were more, scattered among the rocks, embedded in crevices, lying on the ground as if they were worthless pebbles. I gathered more diamonds, picking the best ones, stuffing them into every pocket, into my shirt, anywhere I could store them. If I survived, and that was still very much in question, I would be wealthy beyond my wildest dreams. But first, I had to escape the valley. The cliffs surrounding it were steep, nearly vertical. I could not climb them. The only way out was the way the meat came in, carried by birds, which meant I needed to make myself appealing to a bird. I needed to attach myself to one of these sheep carcasses and hope an eagle or rock would carry me out. Sinbad shook his head at the memory. It was perhaps the most desperate plan I had ever conceived, but I was getting good at desperate plans. They seemed to be the only kind that worked. I found a relatively fresh sheep carcass and unwrapped it from its leather covering. Then I lay down on top of it and wrapped both myself and the meat in the leather, binding us together as tightly as I could. I left just enough opening to breathe and to see a small patch of sky. Then I waited. The sun moved across the sky. Hours passed. I began to think no bird would come, that I would die here wrapped in leather and sheep blood, that this plan was even more foolish than attaching myself to a rock's leg. But then I heard it, the rush of air, the sound of massive wings. A shadow fell across me. Talons gripped the leather bundle, and then we were rising, lifting into the air, the ground falling away below. This bird was smaller than the rock, an eagle, though larger than any eagle I had seen before. It carried me over the cliffs, out of the valley, to a rocky outcropping where it had a nest. It released the bundle, preparing to tear into its prize. I burst out of the leather wrapping, shouting, waving my arms. The eagle screeched in alarm and took flight, abandoning its meal. I stood on the rocky outcrop, laughing like a madman, diamonds falling from my pockets, surrounded by the bones of previous meals the eagle had brought here. And then I heard voices, human voices, coming from below the outcrop. I looked over the edge and saw them. A group of merchants, perhaps 10 men, staring up at me in astonishment. These were the diamond traders, the ones who threw meat into the valley and waited for birds to retrieve it. They had seen the eagle carry up what they thought was a sheep carcass. They had not expected a man to emerge from it. Sinbad smiled at the memory. One of the merchants shouted up to me, "Who are you? How did you get in the valley? Are you a jinn? A demon?" "I am Sinbad," I called back, "a merchant like yourselves. I was stranded on an island and carried here by a rock. I mean you no harm. I only want to go home." They helped me down from the outcrop, still staring at me as if I might disappear like smoke. I told them my story. The second voyage, the abandonment, the serpents, the rock, the valley. They listened with expressions that shifted between disbelief and wonder. When I finished, their leader, a shrewd man named Mahmoud, said, "You have had adventures that most men cannot imagine, but you are also a thief. You have taken diamonds from the valley that belongs to all traders who use it." I emptied my pockets, showing them the stones I had gathered. There were perhaps 30 diamonds, some as large as eggs, a fortune in gems, more than enough to make me wealthy for life. "Take half," I told Mahmoud. "Half for you and your men, to compensate for using your valley. Half for me, as payment for the entertainment of my story." "Is this fair?" Mahmoud examined the diamonds, weighing them in his hand, assessing their quality. Finally, he nodded. "It is more than fair. These stones are excellent quality. Half of this is more than we typically gather in a month of operations. You are either very lucky or blessed by Allah." "Both," I said, "and neither. I am alive by luck and blessing, yes, but I have paid a price you cannot see. I have lived through nightmares. I have been abandoned twice. I have clung to a rock's leg and wrapped myself in a dead sheep. This wealth is not a gift. It is compensation for suffering." The old man looked around at his guests. Mahmoud and his men took me with them. We traveled for 3 weeks to reach the nearest port. Along the way, they taught me about the diamond trade, about how to assess quality, about which stones were valuable and which were merely pretty. By the time we reached the port, I understood that the diamonds I still possessed were worth more than everything I had owned before all my voyages combined. I booked passage on a ship heading west, toward Basra, toward home. The voyage took 2 months, stopping at numerous ports along the way. At each stop, I traded some of my diamonds for gold, for goods, for investments that would continue to generate wealth long after the stones were gone. And finally, after more than a year away, after being presumed dead for the second time, I returned to Baghdad. Sinbad paused, his voice growing softer. My neighbors stared when they saw me walking down the street. Word had reached Baghdad that the ship I had sailed on had returned without me, that I had been left on an island, presumed lost. Some of them thought I was a ghost. Others thought I had somehow survived and made my way home through sheer determination. Both were true, in a way. I was a ghost, a shadow of the naive young man who had left seeking adventure and wealth. And I had survived through determination, though luck and divine intervention had played their parts as well. I was now truly wealthy, not comfortable, as I had been after the first voyage. Wealthy. I bought a larger house. I invested in businesses. I gave generously to the poor, remembering what it felt like to have nothing. I swore once again that I would never go to sea again, that 2 voyages were enough, that I had learned my lesson. The old man looked directly at Sinbad the porter. But of course I had not learned. Not really. Because the sea had shown me wonders as well as terrors. It had shown me diamond valleys and enormous birds. It had shown me that the world was larger and stranger than I had imagined. And once you know that, once you have seen the impossible made real, you cannot go back to being the person who believed the world was small and safe and ordinary. So yes, I returned to Baghdad wealthy. Yes, I lived comfortably for several years. But the restlessness returned. The hunger for more, not more wealth, for I had enough of that, but more experience, more adventure, more proof that I was alive and not just existing. And so there was a 3rd voyage, and a 4th, and a 5th, each one bringing new wealth and new nightmares, each one taking something from me that I could never get back. Innocence, peace, the ability to feel truly safe, friends who did not survive what I survived. He fell silent for a long moment. But those are stories for other nights. For tonight, you have heard enough. You have heard how a young man's greed led him to be abandoned on an island of serpents, how desperation made him cling to a rock's leg, how he wrapped himself in a dead sheep and was carried by an eagle out of a valley where men were not meant to go. You have heard how the 2nd fortune was made. Sinbad looked around at his guests. Tomorrow, if you wish, I will tell you about the 3rd voyage, about the cannibals who fattened their captives before eating them, about escape and loss and the price of survival. But for now, let us eat and drink and enjoy the safety of these walls, the comfort of this courtyard, the knowledge that tonight, at least, we are not clinging to ropes or hiding from serpents or wondering if we will ever see home again. The servants brought food, and the guests ate and talked quietly among themselves. But Sinbad the porter ate little. He sat in silence, thinking about diamond valleys and enormous birds, about the price of wealth and the cost of survival. He was beginning to understand what the old man had tried to tell him from the beginning, that every fortune has a story, that every story has a price, that the wealth he had envied was bought with experiences he could barely imagine, terrors that would haunt dreams for decades, lessons learned in the hardest possible way. He looked at Sinbad the Sailor, this old man surrounded by luxury, and for the first time, he did not feel envy. He felt something closer to pity, or perhaps to understanding. The old man caught his gaze and nodded slightly, as if reading his thoughts, as if acknowledging that yes, the porter was beginning to see the truth, beginning to understand why this beautiful house sometimes felt like a prison, why wealth could not buy back what was lost. The evening ended, the guests departed to their rooms, and Sinbad the porter lay awake once more, but this time his dreams were not of drowning. They were of diamonds scattered like stars across dark stone, of serpents hunting in moonlight, of enormous birds blotting out the sun, and of a young man who sought wealth and found it, but learned too late that some prices are too high, some lessons too hard, some fortunes too dearly bought to ever bring peace. The 7 voyages continued, and the truth behind the wealth grew clearer with each tale told. Chapter 7. The 3rd Voyage, the Island of the Ape Men. On the 3rd evening, Sinbad the porter arrived at the sailor's house before sunset. He found the old man in the garden, sitting beneath a pomegranate tree, staring at nothing. There was a heaviness about him tonight, a weight that had not been there the previous evenings. The 3rd voyage, the old man said without looking up, is the one I like to tell least. The first 2 taught me about danger and survival. The 3rd taught me about humanity, or the lack of it. It showed me what people become when civilization falls away, when fear replaces reason, when hunger becomes the only law. He finally looked at the porter. "Are you certain you want to hear this? It is not a tale of adventure and clever escapes. It is darker than that, crueler." "I want to hear," the porter said quietly. "All of it, the truth you promised." The old man nodded slowly. "Very well, but do not say I did not warn you." As the other guests arrived and took their places, as the lamps were lit and food was brought, Sinbad the Sailor began his third tale. "5 years passed after my return from the second voyage," he said. 5 comfortable years in my fine house, with servants and investments and all the security a man could want. I told myself I was content, that the hunger for adventure had finally left me, that I had learned to appreciate safety and stability. But the mind is a strange thing. It forgets pain faster than it forgets wonder. The memory of serpents faded, the terror of hanging from a rock's leg diminished. What remained was the memory of diamond valleys, of impossible birds, of discovering that the world was so much larger and stranger than the small, safe version I had known in Baghdad. So when a group of merchants approached me about joining a trading expedition to the eastern seas, I listened. They spoke of islands rich in spices, of peoples who had never seen proper metalwork and would trade gold for simple tools, of opportunities for profit that required only the courage to sail beyond familiar waters. The old man's voice was flat, emotionless. I should have said no. I should have remembered the abandoned beaches, the serpents, the desperate plans that barely kept me alive. But I did not remember clearly enough, or perhaps I remembered too clearly the feeling of being truly alive, the intensity that comes from facing death and surviving. Perhaps I was addicted to that feeling, and comfort had become a kind of slow death. I invested a large sum in quality trade goods, metalwork, tools, weapons, cloth. I joined a ship with 20 other merchants, all experienced, all confident. We sailed from Basra on a clear spring morning, and for the first month, everything went exactly as planned. We stopped at familiar ports, traded profitably, moved on. The weather was favorable, the ship was well maintained, the captain was competent and cautious. It seemed that perhaps finally I would have a voyage without disaster. Perhaps my luck had changed. Sinbad paused. The sea heard that thought, and the sea answered. We had been at sea for perhaps 6 weeks when we encountered a storm. Not a terrible storm, we had weathered worse, but strong enough that the captain decided to seek shelter. We spotted an island and made for its lee side, anchoring in a protected cove to wait out the weather. The island looked uninhabited, rocky with some vegetation, but no signs of human presence. No smoke from fires, no boats on the beach, no structures visible. The captain decided it was safe to go ashore for water while we waited for the storm to pass. A group of us went in the small boats, 10 merchants and 5 sailors. We landed on a beach of black sand and split up to search for fresh water. I went with 3 other merchants, following what looked like a stream bed up into the rocky interior. We found water quickly, a spring bubbling up among the rocks. We were filling our water skins when we heard the screaming. The old man's hands tightened on his cup. It came from the beach, multiple voices, raised in terror. We ran back toward the shore, crashing through underbrush, our hearts pounding. And when we emerged onto the beach, we saw them. They looked almost human, but not quite. They were the size of men but covered in coarse hair. Their faces were wrong, too flat, with mouths that protruded, filled with teeth designed for tearing. Their hands were too long, their arms too muscular, their eyes too cold and calculating. Ape men, That is what the sailors later called them, creatures somewhere between human and beast, with the worst qualities of both, the cunning of men combined with the savage hunger of animals. There were dozens of them. They had emerged from caves in the cliffs while we were inland. They had surrounded our group on the beach, and as we watched from the cover of the trees, they began to attack. Sinbad's voice became very quiet. It was not a fair fight. These creatures were stronger than men, faster, more vicious. The sailors tried to defend themselves with knives and clubs, but they were overwhelmed quickly. The merchants ran for the boats, but the ape-men were faster. They caught them, dragged them down, and then he stopped, unable or unwilling to continue. After a moment he resumed. The four of us who had gone inland remained hidden in the trees, watching in horror, too terrified to move, to scream, to do anything but watch our companions die. And when it was over, when the beach was quiet again except for the sound of waves, the ape-men gathered the bodies and carried them inland, into the caves. We waited until darkness fell. The ape-men did not return. Slowly, carefully, we crept down to the beach. The boats were destroyed, smashed to pieces. The ship was gone. We could see it in the distance, sails full, moving away from the island. The captain had abandoned us. He had seen the attack from the ship and decided that saving the vessel was more important than saving the passengers. The old man looked up. For the third time, I was stranded. For the third time, I had been left to die on an island. You would think I would have learned. You would think I would have stopped sailing. But no. After this voyage, after what happened next, I still went back to sea. What does that say about me? About the kind of man I had become? He shook his head and continued. The four of us, myself and 3 other merchants, huddled together on the beach in the darkness, trying to decide what to do. We could not stay on the beach. The ape-men would return in the morning. We needed to hide, to find shelter, to survive long enough to think of an escape. We spent the night in the rocks above the beach, taking turns keeping watch. When morning came, we saw the ape-men emerge from their caves and return to the beach, searching for more prey. But they did not venture far from the shore. They seemed to hunt primarily in the coastal areas. This gave us an idea. If we could reach the interior of the island, the higher ground, perhaps we would be safer. Perhaps the ape-men did not venture there. It was a slim hope, but it was all we had. We traveled inland, moving during the day, hiding at night. The island was larger than we had thought, perhaps 5 miles across, with hills and forests and small valleys. On the second day, we found something unexpected, a structure, a building. Sinbad leaned forward. It was ancient, half-ruined, but unmistakably human-made. Stone walls, a roof partially collapsed but still providing some shelter. We explored it cautiously. Inside, we found evidence of previous occupation, old fire pits, broken pottery, some tools left behind. Someone had lived here once, perhaps many people, but they were long gone now. We decided to make this our shelter. We gathered wood and stones, blocked the entrance partially, created a defensible position. We found fruit in the surrounding forest and a small stream nearby. We had water and food and shelter. Perhaps we could survive here for weeks, even months. Perhaps a ship would come. For 3 days we lived in that ruin. We saw no ape-men. We began to relax, to think we might be safe. We even began to plan how we might build a raft, how we might signal passing ships, how we might eventually escape. And then, on the 4th morning, we woke to find we were not alone. Chapter 8. The Giant's House. The creature standing in the entrance to our shelter was not an ape-man, Sinbad said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was something worse. Much worse. It was shaped like a man but stood perhaps 15 feet tall. Its skin was the color of coal, black and rough as stone. Its face was almost human but grotesquely proportioned. A massive jaw, a nose like a boulder, and a single eye. One enormous eye in the center of its forehead, like the Cyclops from ancient Greek tales. The eye fixed on us as we scrambled backward, our screams caught in our throats. The giant reached in with one massive hand and grabbed the merchant nearest the entrance. The man screamed, thrashing, but he might as well have been struggling against a force of nature. The giant lifted him effortlessly and carried him away. Sinbad closed his eyes. We heard the screaming for a long time, too long. When it finally stopped, we sat in silence, too terrified to speak, too horrified to think clearly. The three of us who remained waited in the ruin all day, not daring to leave, hoping the giant would not return. But as evening approached, we heard it coming back, heavy footsteps, the sound of something massive moving through the forest with purpose. It appeared at the entrance again. This time, it simply stood there, its single eye moving from one of us to another, as if selecting. Finally, it reached in and grabbed another merchant, a man named Ibrahim, who I had known in Baghdad, who had a wife and 3 children waiting for his return. Ibrahim fought. He stabbed at the giant's hand with a knife, drawing black blood. But it did not matter. The giant simply squeezed, and we heard bones breaking. Ibrahim's screams echoed through the forest as he was carried away. The old man opened his eyes. That night, the remaining merchant, his name was Hassan, and I made a decision. We could not simply wait here to be taken one by one. We had to fight. We had to do something, no matter how hopeless it seemed. We spent the night preparing. We gathered the driest wood we could find. We sharpened stones into crude weapons. We planned desperately, knowing that our plan would probably fail, but unable to simply accept death without resistance. When the giant returned at dusk the next day, we were ready. As it reached into the ruin to grab one of us, Hassan and I thrust burning branches at its face, aiming for that single, enormous eye. The giant roared, a sound like thunder, like an earthquake that shook dust from the walls. It reared back, batting at the flames. We pressed our attack, thrusting again and again with our burning brands. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, and then we struck true. I drove my burning branch directly into the giant's eye. The creature screamed a sound of such agony that I felt it in my bones. It stumbled backward, clawing at its face, black blood streaming down its cheeks. Sinbad's voice was hollow. We ran. We burst past the blinded giant and ran into the darkening forest, ran without direction, without plan, just ran from that terrible screaming. Behind us, we could hear the giant crashing through the trees, roaring in pain and rage, searching blindly for us. We ran all night. Sometimes we heard the giant in the distance. Sometimes we heard nothing but our own gasping breaths and pounding hearts. By dawn, we had reached the far side of the island. We could see the ocean, could hear waves breaking on rocks. But we could also hear the giant. It had tracked us somehow, by sound or smell or some sense we did not understand. It was getting closer. Hassan and I looked at each other. We were exhausted, unarmed, cornered against the sea. There was nowhere left to run, but Hassan saw something. Away down the cliffs, a narrow path leading to the beach below. "We can make a raft," he gasped. "If we can get to the water before it finds us." We scrambled down the cliff path, loose stones sliding beneath our feet. I could hear the giant above us now, very close, its roars echoing off the rocks. We reached the beach and ran for the driftwood scattered along the shore. We worked frantically, tying logs together with vines, creating something that might float. It did not need to be perfect. It just needed to get us away from the island, away from the giant, away from this nightmare. The raft was barely complete when the giant appeared at the top of the cliff. Even blind, even injured, it had found us. It began to descend the path, moving carefully but still faster than we could prepare. We shoved the raft into the water and climbed aboard. It was crude, unstable, but it floated. We paddled desperately with our hands, trying to get distance from the shore. The giant reached the beach. It waded into the water, feeling its way, reaching for us. Its hand passed within inches of the raft, but we paddled harder, and slowly, painfully slowly, we moved beyond its reach. Sinbad's voice shook. The giant stood in waist-deep water, its ruined face turned toward us, tracking us by sound, and then it began to pick up rocks. Large rocks, boulders, stones the size of a man's head. It threw them blindly, hurling them in our direction. Most missed, but one struck the edge of our raft, shattering several logs. Water poured in through the gap. Hassan tried to hold the logs together, but it was useless. The raft was breaking apart. "We have to swim," I told him. "It's our only chance." We abandoned the raft and began to swim. The water was cold, the current strong. Behind us, I could hear the giant still throwing rocks, the splashes getting farther away as we drifted with the current. We swam for hours, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time loses meaning when you are fighting for your life. My arms grew numb, my legs stopped responding. The shore of the giant's island disappeared behind us. We were alone in the open ocean, with no land in sight, no ship, no hope of rescue. Hassan was tiring. I could see it in his face, in the way his strokes were becoming weaker. "Keep swimming," I told him. "Don't give up." But he was beyond hearing. His head slipped beneath the water. I grabbed him, pulled him up, tried to keep both of us afloat. But he was dead weight now, unconscious or worse. I held on to him as long as I could, but eventually I had to let go. I had to choose between saving him and saving myself. The old man's voice broke. I let him go. I watched him sink into the blue water, and I did not dive after him. I told myself there was nothing I could have done, that we both would have drowned, that survival required hard choices. But I dream of that moment still. I dream of his face disappearing beneath the waves, and I wake up wondering if I am a coward or simply a survivor. He was silent for a long moment. I floated alone for what might have been hours or might have been days. I was beyond exhaustion, beyond fear, beyond thought. I simply floated and waited to die. And then, impossible and improbable, I saw a ship, a merchant vessel, passing perhaps a mile away. I tried to shout, but no sound came from my parched throat. I tried to wave, but my arms would not lift from the water. But someone on the ship had sharp eyes. Someone saw me. The ship changed course, and soon a boat was lowering toward me. Strong hands pulled me from the water. A cup was pressed to my lips, and I heard someone say in a voice that seemed to come from very far away, "You are safe now. Rest." Chapter 9. The Lesson of the Third Voyage. "I woke in a hammock in the ship's hold," Sinbad continued. "I had no memory of being brought aboard, of being given water and food, of being carried below. I remembered only floating and then nothing. The captain came to see me once I was awake. He was a kind man, weathered by years at sea, with eyes that had seen much and judged little. He listened to my story without interruption, and when I finished, he nodded slowly. "You have survived what few men could survive," he said. "The islands you describe are known to sailors, though we avoid them. The ape-men and the giant, these are real dangers, not legends. You are fortunate to be alive." "I don't feel fortunate," I told him. "I feel cursed. 3 voyages, and 3 times I have barely escaped with my life. 3 times I have watched other men die while I survived. What does that make me? Lucky or damned?" The old man looked at his audience. The captain considered this question seriously. Finally, he said, "Perhaps it makes you neither. Perhaps it makes you a man who refuses to die, who chooses survival over surrender. The world needs such men, but the world also asks such men to carry the weight of their survival, to live with the knowledge of who was lost so that they might live." Those words stayed with me, the weight of survival, the cost of being the one who makes it home when others do not. Sinbad took a drink before continuing. The captain's ship was bound for a trading port I had visited on my first voyage. The journey took 3 weeks, and during that time I worked alongside the crew, earning my passage through labor. It felt good to have simple tasks, simple goals, to tie knots, to scrub decks, to haul ropes. Work that did not require desperate plans or impossible choices. We reached port, and I discovered something unexpected. My belongings from the 3rd voyage, the goods I had invested in, that I thought were lost when we were abandoned on the island, had been brought to this port by the ship that had left us behind. The captain had apparently felt some guilt about abandoning his passengers. He had cached our belongings here, thinking perhaps we might somehow survive and reclaim them. I sold the goods at a profit. Added to what remained of my wealth from the 2nd voyage, I was still a rich man, rich enough to book comfortable passage home, rich enough to rebuild my life in Baghdad, rich enough to never need to sail again. I returned home. I bought a larger house. I invested in businesses on land, caravans, not ships. I gave generously to widows and orphans, thinking of Hassan's family, of Ibrahim's children, of all the families who would never see their loved ones again, because I had survived and they had not. The old man's voice grew softer. I told myself I was done with the sea, that 3 voyages were enough, that I had learned my lesson about greed and restlessness and the price of adventure. I meant it sincerely. I believed it completely. But the mind is a liar. The heart is a traitor. Within a year, the memories of terror faded. What remained was the memory of standing on a black sand beach watching dawn break over an unknown island, of floating in the open ocean and seeing a ship appear on the horizon like a miracle, of surviving what should have killed me and feeling more alive than I had ever felt in the safety of Baghdad. And so there was a 4th voyage, and a 5th, and more after that, each one promising profit, each one delivering disaster, each one taking something from me that I could never get back. Sinbad looked directly at the porter. "You asked, that first night, why I have so much while you have so little. Now you have heard 3 of the 7 stories. Now you begin to understand the price. I have wealth, yes. I have this fine house, these servants, these comforts. But I also have dreams that wake me screaming. I have the memory of men I could not save, of choices that haunt me, of a younger self who thought adventure was glorious and learned, too late, that it is mostly terror punctuated by brief moments of wonder. I have survivor's guilt that sits on my chest like a stone. I have the knowledge that every coin in my coffers was bought with someone else's suffering, sometimes my own, sometimes that of people who trusted me, who sailed with me, who died while I lived." The old man stood slowly, his old bones creaking. "Tomorrow, if you wish, I will tell you about the 4th voyage, about being buried alive, about cannibals who fattened their victims before the feast, about escape and capture and the slow erosion of hope. But for tonight, I am tired. My mind is full of giants and ape men and the faces of men who drowned while I swam away. Think carefully before you return tomorrow. These stories get darker. The lessons get harder. The price I paid gets steeper with each voyage. You may decide that you do not want to hear the rest. That ignorance is better than knowledge. That envying my wealth is easier than understanding what it cost. He looked around at all his guests. But if you do return, I will tell you the truth. All of it. The 4th voyage, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th. Every disaster, every desperate plan, every impossible survival. I will show you what lies behind this beautiful facade. I will give you the knowledge I wish someone had given me before I took my first voyage. That adventure is not glorious, wealth is not freedom, and survival sometimes feels like the cruelest punishment of all. The evening ended quietly. The guests departed slowly, thoughtfully, each lost in their own reflections. Sinbad the porter walked home through the dark streets of Baghdad, his mind churning with images of giants and burning eyes and men sinking beneath blue water. He thought about Hassan's wife, who would never know exactly how her husband died, about Ibrahim's children, who would grow up without a father, about the merchant from the first voyage who had fallen from the whale island into the churning sea, about all the nameless sailors and traders who had sailed with Sinbad and never returned. And he thought about the old man sitting alone in his beautiful house, surrounded by luxury but haunted by ghosts. A man who had everything and nothing. A man who had survived 7 voyages but wondered if survival had been worth the cost. The porter had worked hard his entire life for small rewards, had envied those with wealth, had believed that money would solve all problems, bring all happiness, provide all security. But now he was beginning to understand a different truth. That wealth bought comfort, but not peace. That survival came with a price that gold could not pay. That sometimes the poorest man, with his simple life and his dreamless sleep, was richer than the wealthiest merchant with his nightmares and his guilt. He reached his small rented room and lay down on his thin mattress. Around him, other poor people slept in their own small rooms, workers and laborers and porters like himself. They would wake at dawn and work hard for little pay. They would struggle and strain and never have much, but they would also sleep soundly. They would not wake screaming from dreams of drowning. They would not carry the weight of other men's deaths. They would not lie awake wondering if they were blessed or cursed, lucky or damned. For the first time in his life, Sinbad the porter felt something that was not envy when he thought of Sinbad the Sailor. He felt gratitude for his small, simple, safe life, and he felt a deep, abiding pity for the old man who had gained the world but lost something more valuable, the ability to feel at peace, to be at rest, to live without the constant weight of memory pressing down like a stone. Sleep came slowly, but when it came, it was untroubled by giants or serpents or blue water closing over drowning men. For tonight, at least, the porter's poverty was a blessing, and tomorrow he would decide whether to return to hear the rest of the story, whether to learn the full price of the wealth he had once envied, whether to see clearly what he had been blessed to avoid by being too poor to afford adventure. The choice was his. The stories waited. The truth remained to be told, and the 7 voyages continued their slow revelation, showing with each tale that fortune and misfortune are not opposites but twins, inseparable, forever bound together by the choices we make and the prices we pay. Chapter 10. The 4th Voyage, Buried Alive. On the 4th evening, Sinbad the porter stood outside the sailor's blue door for a long time before knocking. He had spent the day thinking about whether he truly wanted to hear more. The first 3 voyages had already given him nightmares, had already changed how he saw the world. But curiosity and something deeper, a need to understand, to see the truth completely, finally made him knock. The door opened. The servant led him to the courtyard, where Sinbad the Sailor sat waiting, looking older tonight, more tired, as if the telling of these stories drained something essential from him. "You came back," the old man said quietly. "I had to," the porter replied. "I need to hear the rest. I need to understand." The old man nodded. "Then sit. The 4th voyage is perhaps the strangest of all my tales. It taught me that some fates are worse than death, that customs which seem barbaric to outsiders have their own terrible logic, that sometimes the living envy the dead." As the other guests arrived and settled into their places, as the familiar ritual of food and drink and lamplighting unfolded, Sinbad the Sailor began his 4th tale. 3 years passed after the 3rd voyage," he said. 3 years during which I swore I would never sail again. 3 years during which I meant it with every fiber of my being. I had nightmares every night, of giants, of ape-men, of watching Hassan sink beneath the waves. I would wake gasping, certain I was drowning, certain I was about to be grabbed by an enormous hand. My friends in Baghdad thought I had lost my mind. I would stop mid-conversation, staring at nothing, seeing things they could not see. I avoided the river, could not bear to be near water. I sold my investments in shipping, wanted nothing to do with the sea or those who sailed it. And yet, the old man paused, and yet when a trusted friend approached me about a trading voyage, a short one, he said, safe waters, established routes, no risks, I found myself listening. I found myself remembering not the terror, but the feeling of standing on deck with wind in my face, of seeing lands no one in Baghdad had ever seen, of feeling truly alive in a way that comfort could never match. I told myself this voyage would be different, that I was older now, wiser, more careful, that I had learned to recognize danger, that I would be cautious, would turn back at the first sign of trouble, would not take foolish risks. Sinbad smiled bitterly. The sea must have laughed at my arrogance. We sailed from Basra with a small fleet, 3 ships traveling together for safety. The voyage began well. We stopped at familiar ports, traded profitably, encountered no difficulties. I began to relax, to think that perhaps my curse had lifted, that perhaps the first 3 voyages had simply been bad luck, and now my luck had changed. We had been at sea for about 2 months when we encountered a storm. A real storm this time, not the mild weather that had driven us to the giant's island. This was a tempest that turned the sea to mountains of dark water, that tore sails and snapped masts, that scattered our small fleet like leaves in wind. For 3 days we fought the storm. The crew worked without rest, bailing water, repairing damage, fighting to keep the ship from foundering. I worked alongside them, too terrified to rest, knowing that survival depended on every hand working, every man doing his part. On the 4th day, the storm finally broke. The sun emerged from behind tattered clouds. The sea calmed to gentle swells. We took stock of our situation. We had survived, but barely. The ship was damaged. We had lost one of our masts, and we were alone. The other 2 ships of our fleet had disappeared during the storm, swept away to unknown fates. The captain consulted his charts and instruments. We were far off course, he said, blown into unfamiliar waters, but he believed he could navigate us back to known routes within a week if the weather held. It was then that the lookout called down from the remaining mast. Land ahead. An island, or perhaps a coast. We needed to make repairs anyway, needed fresh water. The captain decided to make for this land, to anchor and assess our damage properly. The old man's voice grew slower, heavier. The island was beautiful, White beaches, palm trees swaying in gentle wind, clear streams running down from green hills. It looked like paradise. It looked safe, and that should have been my warning. Nothing that looks that perfect ever is. We anchored offshore and went to the beach in our remaining boat. The crew began working on repairs immediately, cutting wood for a new mast, patching sails, refilling water barrels. I and the other merchants walked inland, exploring, looking for anything valuable. Spices, fruits, anything we could trade. We found a village about a mile from the beach. It was clearly inhabited. We could see smoke from cooking fires, hear voices, see people moving between simple houses made of wood and thatch. They looked human, normal, unthreatening. After the ape men and giants, this was a relief. As we approached, the villagers came out to greet us. They smiled. They gestured for us to sit, to rest. They brought us food, strange fruits I had never seen, but sweet and satisfying. They brought us drink, a thick, milky substance in wooden cups. They seemed eager to please, to make us welcome. Sinbad paused. We should have been suspicious. No one is that welcoming to strangers. No one shares their food so freely without wanting something in return. But we were tired, hungry, grateful for kindness after the terror of the storm. We ate, we drank, we relaxed. The food was delicious, rich, fatty, satisfying in a way that made me want more. They kept bringing plates, kept refilling cups, kept encouraging us to eat. And we did. We ate until we were full. And then we kept eating because the food was so good and they were so insistent. I noticed that the villagers themselves did not eat. They watched us, smiling, nodding, but they did not partake of the feast they had prepared. This should have warned me, but my mind was clouded. From exhaustion, from relief at being on solid ground, from whatever was in the food and drink they had given us. After the meal, they showed us to houses where we could rest. Comfortable houses with soft sleeping mats. I remember lying down, feeling drowsy, feeling content, feeling safe for the first time in days. I remember thinking that perhaps my luck really had changed, that perhaps this voyage would end well after all. The old man's hands clenched. I woke to the sound of screaming. One of my fellow merchants, a man named Rashid, was standing in the doorway of the house, his face pale with horror. "Don't eat any more," he gasped. "Don't eat the food they give you. It's drugged. They're fattening us." "Fattening us?" I asked, my mind still clouded. "What do you mean?" "Like livestock," Rashid said, his voice shaking. "I went walking before dawn. I saw cages behind the village, with people in them. Fat people, and I saw what they do to them when they're fat enough. These people are cannibals. They drug travelers, feed them until they're plump. And then," he did not need to finish. I understood. The generous feast, the insistence that we eat more, the strange, drugged feeling. We were being prepared, fattened like cattle before slaughter. Rashid had not eaten as much as the rest of us. His suspicions had been aroused earlier, and he had only pretended to eat, hiding food, dumping out the drugged drink when no one was looking. His mind was clearer than ours, clear enough to see the truth, clear enough to know we had to escape immediately. "The others?" I asked. "Where are the other merchants, the crew from the ship?" "Most are still sleeping," Rashid said. "Still under the drug's influence, but some have already been moved to the cages. We have to leave now while we still can, before they realize we know." We roused the few merchants who could still think clearly. 5 of us, out of the 15 who had come to the village. The others were too drugged, too compliant, already being led away to the fattening cages like docile animals. We could not save them. We could only save ourselves. We crept out of the village at dawn, moving quietly, avoiding the villagers who were beginning to stir. Behind us, I could hear the others being fed their morning meal, could hear them laughing and talking, completely unaware of their fate. The drug kept them happy, kept them eating, kept them blind to the truth. Sinbad's voice dropped. We reached the beach to find our ship gone. The captain and crew had either sailed away during the night, or they too had been taken by the villagers. We were trapped, stranded on an island of cannibals with no way to escape. For 3 days we hid in the forest. We ate only what we could forage, fruits, roots, anything we could find. We drank from streams, careful to avoid the village. We were starving, growing weaker, but at least we were not drugged. At least we were not in the fattening cages. On the 4th day, we saw a ship passing offshore. We ran to the beach, waving, shouting, desperate to be seen. The ship was far out, but someone spotted us. It changed course, coming closer. A boat was lowered. We waded into the water, swimming toward salvation. But the villagers had seen us too. They emerged from the forest, running toward the beach. We swam faster, our hearts pounding, knowing that if they caught us, we would end up in those cages, would be drugged and fattened and eventually consumed. The boat reached us first. Strong hands pulled us aboard. The villagers stood on the beach watching us escape, their faces showing no anger, only disappointment, as if we were livestock that had escaped the pen, as if we were just food that had gotten away. Chapter 11. The City of the Dead. The ship that rescued us was a merchant vessel bound for a city I had heard of but never visited. Sinbad continued. The captain listened to our story with a grim expression. He knew of the cannibal island, he said. Many ships had lost crew there. The villagers used drugs and hospitality as weapons, more effective than spears or arrows. Men who might fight against obvious danger would walk willingly into the fattening cages, smiling, grateful for the feast that was preparing them to become a feast themselves. The voyage to the city took 2 weeks. During that time, I recovered slowly from the drug's lingering effects. My mind cleared. My appetite returned to normal. But my dreams were filled with smiling faces offering food, with the sound of contented laughter from men who did not know they were being prepared for slaughter, with the memory of leaving them behind because we could not save them. We reached the city at last. It was called Serendib, a great port city, wealthy and beautiful, with white buildings rising in terraces up a hillside, with markets full of exotic goods from 100 different lands. The captain suggested I settle there for a time, recover my strength, perhaps find opportunities for trade. I did not want to trade. I wanted to go home. But I had no money for passage. Everything had been on the ship that had either sailed away or been taken by the cannibals. I would need to work, to earn enough for my journey back to Baghdad. So I stayed. The old man took a drink before continuing. The city had a strange custom. I learned about it from a merchant who befriended me, who gave me work in his warehouse. In Serendib, when a married person died, their spouse was buried with them, alive. It was their law, their tradition. If a wife died, her husband would be sealed in the tomb beside her, with a small amount of food and water to accompany her into death. If a husband died, his wife would join him in the grave. I was horrified. But that is murder, I said. How can this be law? It is our way, the merchant explained. Marriage is a bond that transcends death. To break that bond, to let your spouse journey alone into the afterlife, is the greatest dishonor. Better to die together than to live with such shame. I thought it barbaric, cruel. I told myself I would never marry in this city, never risk such a fate. I would work, earn my passage money, and leave as soon as possible. Sinbad's voice grew quiet. But the heart does not always listen to sense. I met a woman. Her name was Safia, and she was beautiful, not with the obvious beauty that draws every eye, but with a quiet grace, an intelligence, a kindness that made you want to be near her. She was the daughter of a wealthy merchant, well-educated, well-spoken. We met in the marketplace. We talked. We met again and again. I fell in love, foolishly, completely, despite knowing the risks, despite knowing the custom. I told myself it did not matter, that we were both young and healthy, that death was far away, that love was worth the risk. We married. Her father approved. I had proven myself a capable merchant, had earned a reputation for honesty and skill. We had a small house near the market. We were happy. For 6 months, we were happy. The old man's voice broke slightly, and then Safia fell ill. It started with a cough, nothing serious, we thought, a simple cold, but it worsened. She developed a fever. The city's physicians came, tried their remedies. Nothing helped. Within 2 weeks she was bedridden. Within 3 weeks she was dying. I sat beside her bed, holding her hand, watching her slip away. She was so young, 22 years old, her whole life ahead of her, and I could do nothing but watch her die and know that her death was also mine. She died on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun rose. I held her as she took her last breath, felt her body grow still, felt the life leave her. And then the priests came, and the burial preparations began. Sinbad looked around at his guests. They gave me a day, one day to say goodbye, to put my affairs in order, to prepare for death. The next morning, I would be sealed in the tomb with Safia's body. It was the law. It was the custom. There was no appealing it, no escape from it. I had married a woman from Serendib. Now I would die according to Serendib's laws. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in our house, surrounded by the life we had built together, the furniture we had chosen, the carpets she had loved, the small garden she had tended. I thought about dying, about being sealed in a tomb with 7 small loaves of bread and a jug of water, to starve slowly in the darkness beside my wife's corpse. I was not ready to die. I was only 30 years old. I had survived whale islands and serpents, giants and cannibals. I had escaped death so many times, and now I would die not from adventure or danger, but from a law, a custom, a tradition that seemed to me nothing but murder disguised as honor. But there was no escape. The priests would come at dawn. The tomb was already prepared. My death was as certain as the sunrise. The old man paused. Or so I thought. But fate, or Allah, or blind luck, had one more impossible escape planned for me. Just before dawn, as I sat in the darkness waiting for the priests, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find a man I did not know, a stranger, rough-looking, with the bearing of a sailor or perhaps a smuggler. He looked at me and said simply, "You are the foreign merchant who married Safia. You are to be buried today." "Yes," I said. "Who are you?" "Someone who knows another way," the man said. "The burial caves are old, very old. They connect to passages that run beneath the city, passages that eventually reach the sea. Most people do not know this. Most people sealed in the tombs die within days. But a few who know the secret, who are strong enough and desperate enough, they can escape." I stared at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Safia was kind to my sister when others were cruel," the man said. "Because I owe her a debt. Because you are young and should not die for a law that serves no one. Listen carefully. I will tell you what you need to know. But whether you use this knowledge or die with honor in the tomb, that choice is yours." Chapter 12. The Escape from the Tomb. The priests came at dawn, just as the man had said they would, Sinbad continued. They were not cruel. They were gentle, respectful. treating me as one would treat someone about to make a great sacrifice. They draped me in white burial cloth. They gave me the 7 loaves of bread and the jug of water that I was permitted to take into the tomb. They led me through the streets of the city to the burial grounds outside the walls. Safia's body had been prepared, wrapped in fine cloth, anointed with oils, placed on a bier carried by bearers. I walked behind her, as was the custom, following my wife to our final resting place. People lined the streets, watching solemnly. Some wept. Others bowed their heads in respect. They were witnessing what they believed to be an act of great devotion. They did not see it as murder. They saw it as love. The burial caves were ancient, carved into a hillside outside the city. Generations of Serendib's dead rested here, sealed in individual tombs, each one marked with the names of husband and wife, joined in death as they had been in life. The priests led us deep into the caves, down narrow passages lit by torches, to a chamber that had been prepared for Safia and me. They placed Safia's body on a stone platform. They gestured for me to lie beside her. "This is where I would die," they explained. "In 3 days, perhaps 4, when the bread and water were gone, I would join her in death. Our spirits would travel together to the afterlife. It was a beautiful fate," they said. "An honorable fate. I should be grateful." I lay down beside my wife's wrapped body. The priests stepped back. They bowed, and then they began to seal the entrance to our tomb with stones and mortar, working quickly, efficiently, as they had done countless times before. The light from the passage grew smaller, narrower, until it was just a crack, then nothing. Complete darkness, complete silence. I was sealed in, buried alive, left to die. The old man's voice grew very quiet. For a long time, I simply lay there in the darkness, feeling Safia's body next to mine, listening to my own breathing, feeling the weight of stone and earth above me. This was how I would die. This was how my story would end. Not in the ocean, not on some distant island, but in a tomb, sealed away from light and air and life. But then I remembered the stranger's words, the secret passages, the way to the sea. He had given me instructions, where to look, what to search for, how to find the hidden passage that a few desperate souls had discovered over the centuries. Most who were sealed in died without ever knowing it existed. But I knew, and I had a choice. I could lie here and die with honor, fulfilling the custom, joining my wife in death. Or I could search for the passage, could try to escape, could choose life over honor, survival over tradition. What kind of man would I be if I escaped? What kind of husband abandons his wife, even in death? But I thought about Safia. I thought about our conversations, about her intelligence, about the way she questioned traditions even while following them. Would she want me to die? Would she want me sealed in darkness, starving slowly, joining her in a death that served no purpose? Or would she want me to live, to return to Baghdad, to carry her memory with me as a treasure, rather than share her tomb as a corpse? Sinbad looked at his audience. I chose life. Perhaps that makes me a coward. Perhaps that makes me dishonorable. But I chose to search for the passage, to try to escape, to survive if survival was possible. I stood in the complete darkness and began to feel along the walls. The stranger had told me the passage would be in the back corner of the tomb, hidden behind loose stones. I worked by touch alone, my fingers searching, finding nothing, searching again. Hours passed. My bread and water sat untouched. I had no time for eating. I had to find the passage before despair or darkness drove me mad. And then I felt it. Stones that moved, a gap behind them, a space that opened into something, a passage, a way out. The stranger had told the truth. I removed stones one by one, creating an opening large enough to squeeze through. On the other side was a narrow tunnel, carved by ancient hands or perhaps by water over eons. I could not see it, could only feel my way forward, crawling in complete darkness, the weight of the earth pressing down above me. I crawled for what might have been hours or might have been days. Time loses meaning in complete darkness. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes so narrow I had to exhale to squeeze through, sometimes opening into larger chambers where other tombs had been built, where I could feel bones beneath my hands, the remains of others who had been sealed away centuries ago. Sometimes I heard sounds, voices perhaps, or the echo of footsteps, or simply the movement of earth and stone. Sometimes I heard nothing but my own breathing, my own heartbeat, the scrape of my body against rock. I began to wonder if this passage truly led anywhere, or if I would simply crawl until I died, lost in the darkness beneath the earth, my bones joining the countless others who rested in these ancient tombs. But then I smelled it. Salt, the ocean. The passage was leading toward the sea, just as the stranger had promised. I crawled faster now, ignoring the pain in my hands and knees, ignoring exhaustion and thirst, following that smell like a prayer, like hope, like salvation. The passage began to angle upward. I could hear waves, could hear wind. And then suddenly I saw light. Dim at first, just a gray glow, but unmistakably light. The passage opened onto a cliff face above the sea. I emerged into the afternoon sun, blinking, gasping, alive. Sinbad paused, his eyes distant. I stood on that cliff, looking down at the waves crashing against rocks far below. Behind me was the passage, the tomb, the city where I was presumed dead. Ahead was only ocean and uncertainty. I had no food, no water, no plan. But I was alive. I had escaped. I had survived yet again. I climbed down the cliff face, moving carefully, knowing that surviving burial only to fall and die would be the cruelest irony. I reached the beach and began walking along the shore, following the coastline, hoping to find a fishing village or a port, somewhere I could find help. I walked for 2 days, eating shellfish I found on rocks, drinking from small streams that ran down to the sea. My body was weak from days without proper food, from the crawl through the passages, from grief and shock and the lingering effects of being sealed in darkness. But I kept walking. And then I saw a ship anchored in a small cove. It was a trading vessel, taking on fresh water. I staggered down to the beach, waving, shouting. The crew saw me, this wild-looking man in torn burial cloth, filthy and exhausted, emerging from nowhere. They took me aboard. They gave me water, food, clothes. They listened to my story with expressions that shifted from skepticism to wonder to horror. But they believed me, or at least they did not throw me back onto the beach. They were sailing west, back toward the familiar trade routes. They would take me as far as Basra. From there, I could make my way home to Baghdad. The old man fell silent for a long moment. That was the 4th voyage. The voyage that taught me about customs and laws, about love and loss, about being buried alive and crawling through darkness to reach light. The voyage that cost me a wife I loved, that forced me to choose between honor and survival, that showed me I was capable of abandoning even the woman I loved if the alternative was death. I returned to Baghdad wealthy from previous voyages, but spiritually bankrupt. I had survived 4 voyages. I had been abandoned 3 times. I had been attacked by ape men and giants and cannibals. I had been sealed in a tomb and left to die. And still I lived. Still I survived. Still I came home. I told myself there would be no more voyages. that 4 was enough, that I had learned every lesson the sea could teach, that I would stay in Baghdad, would rebuild my life, would never again risk what I had risked. He looked around at his guests, but of course there were more voyages, a 5th where I met the old man of the sea, who wrapped his legs around my neck and rode me like a beast of burden, a 6th where I found an underground river that ran beneath the earth for hundreds of miles, a 7th and final voyage that almost destroyed my mind as well as my body. But those are stories for tomorrow and the day after. For tonight, you have heard about burial and escape, about love and loss, about the choice between honor and survival. You have heard how close I came to dying in darkness, and how I chose to live even when living meant breaking sacred vows, abandoning tradition, walking away from the wife I had promised to accompany into death. The old man stood slowly. Tomorrow, if you return, I will tell you about the 5th and 6th voyages, about horrors worse than anything I had yet faced, about survival that felt like curse rather than blessing, about coming home again and wondering why Allah kept saving me, what purpose my survival served, whether being the one who always lives while others die is a blessing or a punishment. He looked directly at Sinbad the porter. You came back tonight despite knowing these stories would be dark, despite knowing they would haunt your dreams. Will you come back again? Will you hear the final voyages? Will you see completely what lies behind this wealth you once envied? The porter was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Yes, I will come back. I need to hear all of it. I need to understand the full price. Otherwise, these stories are incomplete. Otherwise, I will always wonder what more there was to learn. The old man nodded. Then tomorrow, the 5th and 6th voyages, the darkest tales of all. The stories that explain why this house, beautiful as it is, sometimes feels like a tomb. Why wealth, vast as mine is, cannot purchase peace. Why I wake some nights believing I am still crawling through darkness beneath the earth, still searching for light that may not exist, still wondering if I am truly alive or simply a ghost who does not know he is dead. The evening ended. The guests departed, and Sinbad the porter walked home through the streets of Baghdad, thinking about tombs and passages, about the choice between honor and survival, about a man who had loved and lost and crawled through darkness to reach light. He thought about his own simple life, his small room, his work as a porter. The poverty that had once seemed like a curse now seemed almost like protection. He would never be sealed in a tomb. He would never have to choose between dying with honor or escaping with shame. He would never lie in darkness wondering if he had the strength to keep crawling, to keep searching, to keep choosing life over and over again, no matter what it cost. Sleep came slowly, and when it came, it brought dreams of narrow passages deep in the earth, of crawling through bone-filled chambers, of seeing light ahead but never quite reaching it, of moving forward in darkness guided only by hope and the faint smell of salt air. Dreams that were not quite nightmares, just truth, dressed in the images of night, just stories, working their slow transformation, just the beginning of understanding what it costs to survive again and again when others do not. The 7 voyages continued their telling. The truth continued its revelation, and the porter continued his journey toward understanding, not of wealth, but of its price, not of adventure, but of its cost, not of survival, but of what survival takes from those who refuse to die. Chapter 13. The 5th and 6th Voyages, the Old Man and the River. On the 5th evening, Sinbad the porter arrived at the blue door as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. He had spent the day in quiet reflection, barely working, his mind full of tombs and passages and the choices men make when death seems certain. The servant who opened the door looked at him with something like sympathy, as if he too understood the weight these stories carried. In the courtyard, Sinbad the Sailor sat alone, staring into the fountain's water. He looked up as the porter approached, and there was something different in his expression tonight. A resignation, perhaps, or a weariness that went deeper than age. "Tonight I will tell you 2 voyages in one evening," the old man said. "The 5th and 6th, not because they are short, they are not, but because they are connected in ways the others were not. They show a progression, a deepening of understanding, a movement toward the final journey that would change everything. And because I am tired of spreading these tales across so many nights, I want them told. I want them finished. I want to be done with the telling." As the other guests arrived, as the familiar ritual began, the old man took a deep breath and began. 2 years after I escaped the tomb, I sailed again. The 5th voyage. I have tried to explain the restlessness, the need to return to the sea despite everything it had taken from me. But perhaps there is no explanation. Perhaps I was simply broken in some way, unable to be at peace, unable to accept safety. Or perhaps I was addicted to survival, to the feeling of being truly alive that only came when death was near. The 5th voyage began well, as they always did. Good weather, profitable trades, no disasters. We were 3 months into the journey when we stopped at an island to take on fresh water. It was a pleasant island, uninhabited as far as we could tell, with fruit trees and clear streams. I went inland alone, enjoying the solitude, the quiet. I sat beneath a tree and ate some fruit, and that was when I heard it, a rustling in the branches above. I looked up to see an old man looking down at me. His skin was dark and leathery, his hair white, his body thin but wiry. He gestured to me, making sounds that might have been words, but in no language I knew. He seemed to be asking for help, pointing to himself and then to the ground, as if he wanted me to help him down from the tree. Sinbad's voice grew tight. I was a fool. I had survived 4 voyages, had learned to be suspicious, to recognize danger, but an old man in a tree seemed harmless, pitiable. I reached up to help him. He put his legs on my shoulders, meaning, I thought, to climb down, but he did not climb down. Instead, his legs wrapped around my neck, and suddenly I could not breathe, could not move. His legs were like iron, squeezing my throat, choking me. I tried to throw him off, but he held on. I tried to pull his legs away, but they would not budge. They were locked around my neck as if they had grown there. And then he released the pressure slightly, just enough for me to breathe, but he did not release his grip. He stayed on my shoulders, his legs wrapped around my neck, and he began to gesture, forward, toward the beach. He wanted me to walk, to carry him, and when I hesitated, his legs tightened again, choking me until I obeyed. The old man looked around at his listeners. I became his beast of burden, his slave, his horse. He rode on my shoulders, directing me with pressure from his legs, tighten to stop, release to go, tighten on one side to turn. He controlled me completely, and there was nothing I could do. I could not throw him off, could not rest, could not sleep. If I tried to lie down, his legs would tighten until I stood again. If I tried to reach the ship, he would steer me away. I was trapped in my own body, a prisoner controlled by this creature on my shoulders. Days passed. I carried him through the forest, across beaches, up hills. He plucked fruit from trees as we passed, eating contentedly while I starved. He found streams and drank while I was allowed only small sips. I grew weaker, thinner. My legs trembled with exhaustion, but I could not stop, could not rest, could only keep walking, keep carrying this terrible burden, keep living as a slave to this thing that had seemed like a helpless old man. Sinbad's voice dropped to a whisper. I began to pray for death, to hope that my legs would finally give out, that I would collapse and his choking would finish me, because death seemed preferable to this endless walking, this eternal servitude, this existence as nothing more than a means of transport for a parasitic creature. But then I remembered something from one of the ports we had visited, a merchant telling me about a particular kind of fruit that, when fermented, produced a strong wine. And I realized I had seen such fruit on this island. If I could make wine, if I could get the old man to drink it, perhaps I could escape. It took me 3 days to find the right fruit and gather enough. 3 days of carrying my burden, of walking and being steered like an animal. I crushed the fruit in hollow gourds, added water, left them in the sun to ferment, and I waited, continuing to carry the old man, continuing to serve as his unwilling mount. After several days, the fruit had fermented into a crude but potent wine. I pretended to drink from one of the gourds, then set it down. The old man reached down and took it, curious. He smelled it. Then cautiously, he drank. His legs loosened slightly on my neck. He drank more and more. The wine was strong, and he was not accustomed to it. Within minutes, I could feel him swaying on my shoulders, his grip weakening. His legs, which had been like iron, became loose, uncoordinated. I reached up and grabbed his legs. This time they came away. I threw him off my shoulders with all the strength I had left. He fell to the ground, drunk, confused, trying to stand, to grab me again. But I was faster. I found a rock, a large stone, and I brought it down on his head, again and again, until he stopped moving, until I was certain he was dead. The old man was silent for a moment. I had killed him, this thing that had enslaved me, that had ridden me like an animal for weeks. I felt no guilt, only relief, only the joy of being free again, of standing upright without a burden on my shoulders, of touching my own neck and feeling nothing but my own skin. I made my way back to the beach where we had originally landed. The ship was gone. It had left weeks ago, assuming I was lost. But there were fishermen on the beach, locals from a nearby village. They stared at me, this wild, skeletal man emerging from the forest. And when I told them my story, when I described the old man who had enslaved me, they nodded with understanding. "The old man of the sea," they said. "You are the first we have known to escape him. Most who carry him die from exhaustion. Their bodies are found with his corpse still wrapped around their necks, even in death. You are fortunate. You are blessed." They gave me food and water. They helped me regain my strength. And when a trading ship stopped at their village a week later, they negotiated passage for me. I sailed away from that island, my shoulders still aching, my neck still bruised, carrying the memory of weeks as a slave to a parasitic creature who had seemed harmless and proved to be a devil. Sinbad took a long drink before continuing. That was the 5th voyage. It taught me that evil does not always announce itself, that sometimes the greatest danger comes from what seems weak and helpless. That slavery can take many forms, and the worst kind is the slavery that uses your own body as a prison. I returned to Baghdad. I recovered, and I swore, once again, that I would never sail again, that 5 voyages were more than enough, that I had learned every possible lesson. The old man smiled bitterly, and yet, within 2 years, I was planning the 6th voyage. Because the restlessness returned, because safety felt like death, because I was broken in ways I did not understand, and could not repair. The sea was killing me slowly, voyage by voyage, but staying in Baghdad was killing me faster, day by day, in the slow death of comfort and routine. Chapter 14. The Underground River and the Raft of Desperation. The sixth voyage, Sinbad continued without pause, began as they all did, with a ship, with merchants, with trade goods and optimism. We sailed east, toward lands I had visited before, stopping at familiar ports. Everything was routine, everything was safe, until the storm. This storm was unlike any I had experienced. It lasted not days but a week, battering our ship relentlessly, driving us far off course into waters no one recognized. When it finally broke, we found ourselves near a rocky coast, mountainous and forbidding. The ship was badly damaged, taking on water. The captain decided we had to make for shore before we sank. We anchored in a small bay and went ashore to assess our situation. The coast was desolate. Sharp rocks, no vegetation, no signs of life. But we needed to find materials to repair the ship, needed to find fresh water. We split into groups to explore. I went with a small party inland, following what looked like a dried riverbed between steep cliffs. We walked for hours, finding nothing, growing increasingly worried. And then the riverbed opened into a valley that made us stop and stare in disbelief. It was full of goods, bales of silk, bundles of spices, carved ivory, worked metal, treasures from dozens of different lands piled haphazardly along the valley floor, as if ships from around the world had emptied their cargo here. But there were no ships, no people, no explanation for how these goods had come to this remote, desolate place. Sinbad's voice grew thoughtful. We approached cautiously, examining the goods. Many were damaged by weather and time. Others were still in good condition. It was a fortune in trade goods, abandoned or lost, worth more than our entire ship's cargo. And then one of my companions noticed something. The valley floor was damp. Water was seeping up through the ground. And at the far end of the valley there was an opening, a cave mouth, dark and forbidding, from which came the sound of rushing water. We investigated the cave. Inside we found a river, an underground river flowing fast and strong, emerging from darkness and disappearing into darkness. And floating in that river, caught against rocks, were more goods, more bales and bundles, waterlogged but recognizable, ship's cargo. We understood then. This river flowed beneath the earth, emerging somewhere out at sea. Ships had discovered it, perhaps, or been caught in storms and driven into its mouth. Their cargo had been swept through underground passages and deposited here, in this valley, spat out by the river before it dove deeper into the earth. My companions wanted to gather the goods that were still valuable, take them back to our ship, salvage what we could. But I was thinking about something else, about the river, about where it flowed. If it came from the sea and returned to the sea, flowing beneath the earth, perhaps it was a way out. Perhaps it was an escape route if we could not repair our ship. The old man shook his head. It was a mad idea, a desperate idea, but I had built a career on mad, desperate ideas that somehow worked. I convinced two of my companions to help me. We built a raft from the wood we found in the valley, planks from broken crates, logs from who knows where. We made it as sturdy as we could, lashed it together with rope salvaged from the abandoned goods. We loaded it with water, food, and some of the valuable cargo. And then we launched it into the underground river. We climbed aboard, pushed off from the rocks, and let the current take us into darkness, into the earth, into the unknown. Sinbad's voice became distant. I have been in darkness before. In the tomb beneath Serendib I crawled through passages I could not see. But this was different. This was darkness while moving, while being carried by water, while having no control over direction or speed. The river pulled us along, faster and faster, the sound of rushing water echoing off unseen walls. We crashed against rocks we could not see. The raft spun and bucked, water poured over us. One of my companions was swept off the raft in the first hour. I heard him scream once, heard the sound cut off abruptly, and then nothing, just the roar of water and darkness. The other companion and I clung to the raft. We had no torch. Fire was impossible in this wet darkness. We had no way to steer. We could only hold on and pray and hope that the river would eventually bring us back to light, to air, to life. Time lost meaning. Were we in the darkness for hours, days? I do not know. I know that we ran out of water, that we drank from the river itself, though it tasted of minerals and earth. I know that we grew weak, that my companion began to speak to people who were not there, to see things in the darkness that only he could see. Madness was taking him. And then, suddenly there was light, not bright, just a gray glow ahead. The river was emerging from the earth. We were racing toward that light, the current faster than ever, pulling us toward what? A waterfall? A chasm? Salvation? We burst out of the cave mouth into blinding daylight. The river had emerged from a cliff face, was flowing across a plateau. We had survived. We had passed through the earth and come out the other side. My companion was laughing, crying, thanking Allah. I simply lay on the raft, too exhausted to feel anything but a dull relief. The river flowed for several more miles across the plateau before emptying into a lake. At the lake's shore, we saw people, a village, civilization. We steered the raft to shore, stumbled onto solid ground, and collapsed. The old man paused. The villagers took us in, fed us, cared for us. They told us we were in a land far to the east of where we had started, that the underground river we had traveled was a legend among their people, that few had ever attempted it, and fewer had survived. My companion never fully recovered his mind. The darkness had broken something in him, but I had survived once again. The raft had held together. The river had brought us through. And we had even managed to keep some of the valuable cargo, enough to pay for our care, for passage home, for everything we needed. We traveled overland to a port city, then booked passage on a ship heading west. The journey back to Baghdad took months. By the time I finally walked through the gates of my home city, I had been gone for more than 2 years. Once again, I had been presumed dead. Once again, I returned as if from the grave. Sinbad looked at his audience. 6 voyages, 6 times leaving home in search of profit or adventure or something I could not name, 6 times nearly dying, 6 times surviving when others did not, 6 times returning to Baghdad wealthy and haunted and wondering why Allah kept saving me, what purpose my survival served. After the 6th voyage, I was done, truly done, not with the false conviction of previous returns, but with a deep, bone-weary understanding that I could not survive a 7th voyage, that my luck, whatever had sustained me through giants and cannibals and burial and enslavement, would eventually run out, that the next voyage would be the one from which I did not return. I invested my wealth wisely. I bought properties, established businesses, created income that did not require me to sail. I married again, a good woman from Baghdad who knew nothing of my adventures, who saw me as a prosperous merchant, not a scarred survivor. I had children. I built a life, a real life, not the half-life of someone waiting to return to the sea. The old man's voice grew very soft. For 7 years I stayed. For 7 years I was content, and I truly thought, that the sailing days were over, that I had finally learned, that I had finally become the man I was meant to be, a husband, a father, a merchant who traded safely by land. But then came the summons. The Caliph himself, Harun al-Rashid, requested my presence. He had heard of my travels, of my adventures, of my survival against impossible odds. And he had a mission, a diplomatic mission to a distant land, a journey that required someone experienced with foreign lands, someone who could be trusted with matters of state. He was asking me to make one more voyage, the 7th, the final journey. Chapter 15, The 7th Voyage and the Return Home. I could not refuse the Caliph, Sinbad said quietly. To refuse would be to dishonor him, to risk his displeasure, perhaps to endanger my family. And yet I knew with a certainty deeper than thought, that this 7th voyage would be different from all the others, that it would test me in ways the previous 6 had not, that I might not survive it, or worse, that I might survive it and wish I had not. The mission was simple in concept. I was to carry gifts and messages to a great king in a distant land, to establish diplomatic relations, to open trade routes. I was given a fine ship, a hand-picked crew, valuable cargo. Everything was provided for. Everything was arranged. It should have been a straightforward journey. We sailed east, following routes I knew, stopping at ports I had visited before. For 2 months, everything went perfectly. Too perfectly. I grew nervous, waiting for disaster, knowing it would come. It came during the 3rd month, but not in any way I had anticipated. We were attacked by pirates, not the organized naval forces of hostile kingdoms, but raiders, desperate men in fast ships, dozens of them, surrounding us, overwhelming our defenses through sheer numbers. The battle was brief and brutal. Our crew fought bravely, but we were merchants and diplomats, not warriors. The pirates boarded us, killed those who resisted, and took the rest of us prisoner. The ship, the cargo, the gifts for the distant king, all seized. We had failed our mission before even reaching our destination. Sinbad's voice grew hollow. The pirates took us to their island base, and there they sold us. Like cattle, like goods, like objects to be traded. We were slaves now. All of us, merchants, sailors, diplomats, reduced to property. I was purchased by a merchant who specialized in a particular trade. Ivory. He sent his slaves into the forests to hunt elephants, to harvest their tusks. It was dangerous work. Elephants are not passive prey. They fight, they kill. Many slaves died in this work, but that did not matter to the merchant. Slaves were cheap. Ivory was valuable. The calculation was simple. For months I lived as a slave. I woke before dawn. I went into the forests with other slaves, all of us carrying ropes and spears. We tracked elephants. We tried to kill them without being killed ourselves. Many of my fellow slaves died, trampled, gored, crushed. I survived through luck and caution and the skills I had learned on 6 previous voyages. But it was a different kind of survival. Not the dramatic escapes from monsters and disasters, but the grinding, daily survival of servitude, of having no freedom, no choices, no hope of anything better. This was worse in some ways than any of my previous ordeals, because those had been temporary, terrible but temporary. This seemed permanent. This seemed like the rest of my life. The old man's hands trembled. I began to understand why some slaves simply gave up, simply walked into danger without defending themselves, welcoming the elephant's charge that would end their suffering. Death seemed preferable to this endless, hopeless existence. But I could not give up. Some stubborn core of myself refused to surrender. Even when surrender seemed like mercy, I kept hunting, kept surviving, kept hoping that somehow, impossibly, I would find a way to escape. And then I discovered something. In my months of tracking elephants through the forests, I had learned their habits, their patterns. And I had found something my master did not know about. A place where old elephants went to die. An elephant graveyard, where countless tusks lay scattered on the ground, free for the taking, requiring no hunting, no danger, no death. I told my master about this place, showed him the fortune in ivory that lay there, unguarded, waiting to be harvested. His eyes gleamed with greed. With this much ivory, he said, he could become one of the wealthiest men in the region. And I who had shown him this treasure, what reward should I receive? Freedom, I said. I want my freedom and passage home to Baghdad. He considered this. A slave was worth something, yes, but the ivory I had shown him was worth far more. The trade was favorable. He agreed. I was to be freed. Once we had harvested the elephant graveyard, once he had secured his fortune, I would be given my freedom and a ship would carry me home. Sinbad smiled bitterly. And so it happened. We gathered the ivory, more than we could carry, more than ships could hold. My master became wealthy beyond his dreams, and I, as promised, was freed, given clothes, money, and passage on a ship bound west. But freedom after slavery feels different from freedom that has never been lost. I stood on the deck of that ship, sailing away from the island, and I felt hollow, empty. I had survived my 7th voyage, but something essential had been taken from me, some part of myself that I would never recover. The journey home took months. I stopped at many ports, retracing the routes of my previous voyages. At each stop, I remembered who I had been when I was last there. Younger, more confident, still believing that survival was triumph, that coming home was victory. But I understood now what I had not understood before, that each survival cost me something, that each escape took a piece of myself and left me diminished, that I had survived 7 voyages, yes, but the man who had begun those voyages was dead. That man had died somewhere between the Whale Island and this moment, killed not by giants or serpents or cannibals, but by the accumulation of trauma, by the weight of too much surviving. I reached Baghdad at last. I walked through familiar streets to my house, to my family. My wife wept with joy and relief. My children, older now, barely recognized me. My friends celebrated my return, but I felt distant from all of it, as if watching from very far away, as if I was already a ghost, haunting my own life. The old man looked around at his guests. That was the 7th voyage. It ended not with dramatic escape or impossible survival, but with freedom that felt like defeat, with homecoming that felt like exile, with survival that felt like the cruelest punishment of all. To keep living when the man you were has died, to keep breathing when the joy has gone out of breathing. I never sailed again after that. Not because I swore off the sea. I had done that after every voyage and it had meant nothing, but because something in me was finally, completely broken. The restlessness was gone. The hunger for adventure was gone. What remained was just exhaustion, and the understanding that I had pushed my luck as far as it could be pushed, that Allah had saved me 7 times, but would not save me an 8th. Sinbad the Sailor fell silent. The courtyard was completely quiet. Even the fountain seemed to have hushed its voice. The stars shone bright above, indifferent and eternal. So now you know, the old man said, looking directly at Sinbad the porter. Now you have heard all 7 voyages. Now you understand what lies behind this wealth you envied. What prices were paid for this house, these servants, these comforts? Was it worth it? I cannot answer that question. Some days I think yes. I lived, I survived, I have stories no other man can tell. Other days I think no. I lost too much, paid too dearly, would trade all of this for the chance to have lived a quiet life without trauma, without nightmares, without the burden of being the one who always survives when others do not. He gestured around the courtyard. This house is beautiful, but it is also a museum, a monument to survival. Every tapestry was bought with fear. Every jewel was paid for with someone's life. Every comfort rests on a foundation of others' deaths. The men who drowned, who were eaten, who were crushed, who died while I lived. You asked that first night why Allah gave me so much while giving you so little. Now I will ask you, knowing what you know now, would you trade places with me? Would you take my wealth if it came with my memories? Would you sleep in my bed if it meant waking from my dreams? Sinbad the porter sat very still. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. No, I would not trade. I came here envying your wealth. I leave grateful for my poverty, because poverty is just lack of money. What you have, what you carry, is lack of peace. And peace, I now understand, is more valuable than all the gold in the world. The old man nodded slowly. Then these stories have served their purpose. You have learned what I needed you to learn, that fortune and suffering are not opposites, but companions, that wealth is not freedom but responsibility, that surviving again and again is not triumph, but burden, that sometimes the greatest blessing is a simple, quiet, uneventful life that leaves you with nothing to remember, but also nothing to forget. He stood, and his guests stood with him. Thank you for listening. Thank you for bearing witness. These stories needed to be told, needed to be heard, needed to live beyond my own memory. You will carry them now, will share them, will pass them on, and perhaps someone else, somewhere, sometime, will hear them before making a choice to seek adventure, to chase wealth, to risk everything for the promise of more. And perhaps these stories will save them from the mistakes I made, or perhaps not. Perhaps some lessons can only be learned through living. Perhaps some people need to make their own voyages, their own mistakes, their own desperate escapes. But at least they will not say they were not warned. At least they will know that behind every fortune is a story, and behind every story is a price, and the price is always higher than you imagine when you begin. Sinbad the Sailor looked at his guests one final time. Go now. Return to your lives. Take these stories with you. And if you remember nothing else, remember this. The greatest wealth is not what you gain, but what you never lose. Peace, innocence, the ability to sleep without dreams of drowning. These are the treasures worth keeping. Everything else, all the gold, all the silk, all the jewels, they are just stones and cloth and metal. Beautiful, yes. Valuable, yes. But not worth what they cost. Never worth what they cost. The guests departed slowly, each lost in thought. The servants cleared away the food and drink. The lamps were extinguished one by one. The courtyard grew dark and quiet. Only Sinbad the Sailor remained, sitting alone by the fountain, staring into water that reflected nothing but stars and darkness. An old man in a beautiful house, wealthy beyond measure, haunted beyond healing, waiting for death to finally bring the peace that 7 voyages had stolen, and no fortune could buy back. The stories were told, the truths were revealed. The 7 voyages had been laid bare, their terrors and lessons and prices displayed for all to see, and in the telling, perhaps some small measure of peace had been found. Not healing, but at least unburdening, not forgetting, but at least sharing the weight with others who would now carry these tales forward into time. The fountain sang its eternal song. The stars wheeled slowly across the sky, and in a small rented room in a poor quarter of Baghdad, a porter lay on a thin mattress and slept deeply, peacefully, his poverty now understood as the blessing it had always been, his simple life now seen as the treasure it truly was. The 7 voyages were complete, the story was finished, and the greatest lesson had been learned at last, that wealth without peace is poverty, that survival without joy is death, that coming home is not the end of the journey, but the beginning of learning to live with who you have become and what you have lost along the way. This is the tale of Sinbad the Sailor, who voyaged 7 times across the seas, who survived what should have killed him, who gained more than most men dream of and lost more than most men could bear. May we learn from his story. May we choose our voyages wisely. May we count the cost before we pay it. And may we understand before it is too late that sometimes the greatest adventure is the one we choose not to take. The sea still calls. The horizon still beckons. Adventure still promises wealth and wonder and transformation. But now you know what it asks in return. Now you understand the price. Now you can choose with eyes open and hearts aware. The story is told. The choice is yours. The 7 voyages wait for no one. But perhaps having heard these tales, you will choose a different journey. Perhaps you will find your treasure closer to home. Perhaps you will discover that the greatest voyage is not across oceans, but into your own heart, learning to be content, learning to be grateful, learning to see that what you have is enough. This is the end. This is the beginning. This is the wisdom of 7 voyages distilled into one simple truth. Come home. Stay home. Let others chase horizons. You have everything you need right here, right now, if only you have eyes to see it. The sailor's tale is finished. The porter's awakening is complete. The story ends where it began, in a courtyard in Baghdad, under stars that have watched 1,000 voyages begin and end and begin again. May your voyage, whatever it is, bring you home. May your home be the treasure you sought. May your peace be the wealth you need. This is the end. Sleep well.